Imagine you're a Christian living in the 2nd century. The Roman Empire is enormous, unpredictable, and occasionally lethal for people with your beliefs. You gather with a small group in someone's home, maybe by lamplight, maybe in secret, and someone begins reading aloud from a text that claims to be a first-hand account of the afterlife, narrated by the Apostle Peter himself, guided personally by Jesus Christ through the realms of the dead. You hear descriptions of heaven so vivid and so beautiful they make you ache. Then you hear the other part, sinners being hung by their tongues over eternal flames, blasphemers buried up to their necks in filth, murderers trapped in pits of crawling creatures for eternity. And you think, I need to hear this again. For well over a century, that's exactly what early Christians did. They read it, copied it, quoted it, debated it, and some of them treated it as scripture on par with the letters of Paul. Then gradually it disappeared. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic decree, but slowly, quietly, it slipped out of the canon, out of circulation, out of common memory. For more than 1,000 years, most people had no idea it had ever existed. Then in 1886, archaeologists digging in Egypt cracked open a tomb and found a fragment of it buried with a monk. And the questions started flooding back. What was this text? Who actually wrote it? Why did early Christians love it so intensely? And why did it eventually get left out? That's what we're going to investigate today, the Apocalypse of Peter. One of the most striking, most controversial, and most revealing documents to survive from the earliest centuries of Christianity. Before we go any further, let's clear something up, because the word apocalypse tends to trigger a very specific image in the modern imagination. Explosions, collapse, the end of everything, but that's not what it originally meant, and that's not what it means here. In ancient Greek, apocalypsis means an unveiling, a revelation, a lifting of the curtain to show what's normally hidden from human eyes. That's the genre this text belongs to. It's a visionary literature, a guided tour of hidden realities, in this case, the realities of what happens after death. So when we call this an apocalypse, we're not saying it describes the destruction of the world. We're saying it claims to show what the world looks like from the other side of dying. That's a much older, much richer idea than any Hollywood blockbuster, and honestly, it's a more unsettling one. The text itself is attributed to Peter, the apostle, one of the most recognizable figures in all of early Christian tradition. In the narrative, Jesus appears to Peter on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples ask about the end times and the fate of the dead. What follows is a journey. Peter sees the righteous in their rewards, radiant and joyful in a luminous landscape. Then he sees the wicked in their punishments, and the punishments are extraordinarily specific. They're not vague or symbolic. Each category of sinner gets a torment that mirrors their particular crime, and the logic of it is almost poetic in its cruelty. People who murdered children are themselves tormented by the children they killed. People who slandered the righteous are silenced in particularly hideous ways. The text is systematic, almost architectural in how it constructs its moral universe, and that's precisely what made it so gripping to ancient audiences. It wasn't abstract theology, it was a map. Now, here's where it gets complicated, and this is what makes the Apocalypse of Peter genuinely fascinating rather than just historically interesting. We don't actually know who wrote it. The attribution to Peter is almost certainly not historical. Most scholars place the composition of the text in the early to mid-2nd century, roughly 100 years after Peter would have died. That's not unusual for ancient religious literature. It was a completely normal practice in the ancient world to write under the name of a revered authority figure, to give your text the weight of apostolic tradition. What's interesting is not the pseudonymity itself, but what it reveals about the community that produced the text. Someone, somewhere in the early 2nd century, felt compelled to put these specific visions of judgment and reward into the mouth of the most prominent disciple. That tells us something important. And figuring out what exactly it tells us requires us to think carefully about the world those writers and readers actually inhabited. That's where the history gets genuinely rich. The people who first circulated this text were living through something intense. Scattered communities, uncertain legal status, internal debates about what Christians were supposed to believe and how they were supposed to behave, and the ever-present possibility of persecution from outside. The Apocalypse of Peter speaks directly into that world. It reassures the suffering that their tormentors will be punished. It warns the morally compromised that nothing escapes divine accounting. It paints a picture of a cosmos where justice is real and final and absolutely unavoidable. You can see why that message was powerful. You can also start to see why, as Christianity developed and its relationship with Roman power changed, some of those emphases might have become uncomfortable. The manuscript history of this text is its own detective story. We have it in two main forms, a Greek fragment and a longer Ethiopic version, and they don't entirely agree with each other. There are differences significant enough that scholars are still arguing about which version is closer to the original, whether there even was a single original, and what the discrepancies might tell us about how the text was used and modified in different communities over time. One of those differences touches on something genuinely theologically explosive, whether the punishments in hell are permanent, or whether mercy might eventually reach even the condemned. That single question turned the Apocalypse of Peter into a flashpoint in ancient debates about the nature of divine justice, and it's still a debate that religious communities are having today, which is part of why this ancient text still has the power to provoke. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to work through this text carefully, section by section, and we're going to ask serious questions at every turn. What does the text actually say, and what has been misunderstood or sensationalized? What do we know about when and where it was written, and what remains genuinely uncertain? Why did it enjoy such wide circulation among early Christians, and what does it tell us about what those early Christians were afraid of, what they hoped for, and how they understood the relationship between moral behavior and cosmic consequence? And then, maybe most importantly, we're going to look at what happened next. How this vision of hell planted seeds that grew into the medieval imagination of damnation, that fed into Dante, that shaped centuries of Western art and theology and moral culture. This isn't a text that simply vanished. Its fingerprints are everywhere once you know how to look for them. If you're listening to this late at night, maybe having trouble sleeping, that's genuinely why I make these. Drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is there. I check every one of them, and there's something I find endlessly fascinating about the geography of insomnia. Someone in Tokyo at sunrise, someone in Chicago at 2 a.m, all of us sitting with the same ancient questions about what happens after we die. Because that's ultimately what this text is about. Not ancient history, not manuscript fragments, not scholarly debates about canon formation. It's about the most basic human fear there is. What happens next? And one group of people, almost 2,000 years ago, wrote down their answer in the most vivid, unsettling, and hopeful terms they could imagine. Let's find out what they saw. So let's start with the basics, because before we can appreciate what makes this text strange and powerful and historically significant, we need to understand what it actually is. What kind of document are we dealing with? How does it work? What's the shape of the thing? The Apocalypse of Peter belongs to a category of ancient Jewish and Christian writing that scholars call apocalyptic literature. That word again, apocalypsis, the unveiling. The genre has a recognizable set of features. There's usually a human recipient, someone of spiritual authority, a prophet, a patriarch, an apostle. There's a heavenly guide, often an angel, sometimes a divine figure, who takes the recipient on a journey through hidden realms, and the whole point is to show things that normal human perception can't access. The structure of the cosmos, the fate of the dead, the mechanics of divine judgment. These texts were enormously popular across a huge span of time, From the Book of Enoch in the 2nd century before the Common Era all the way through the Book of Revelation at the end of the 1st century, and well beyond that into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when texts like the Apocalypse of Peter were being written and circulated. The reason visions were such a persuasive teaching tool, the reason writers kept reaching for this format century after century, is actually pretty simple when you think about it. Abstract ethical instruction is easy to ignore. You can sit through a lecture about the importance of honesty and walk out unchanged. But if someone shows you in vivid, visceral, sensory detail what happens to liars after they die, that's a different experience entirely. Visionary literature collapses the distance between moral choice and consequence. It makes the invisible visible and the future immediate. It's experiential theology, which is why it works so well as a teaching tool, and why it's also always carried a certain amount of suspicion from institutional authorities who preferred their theology delivered in more controlled forms. We'll come back to that tension. The narrative setup of the Apocalypse of Peter is relatively straightforward, and you can see the bones of it clearly, even before you get into the specific content. The text opens on the Mount of Olives. Jesus is present with his disciples, and the disciples ask two questions that any 1st century or 2nd century Christian community would have found urgent and pressing. They want to know about the signs of the end times, and they want to know about the fate of the dead. Those two questions drive everything that follows. What Jesus does in response is not simply answer them with words. He shows Peter. The revelation is visual, guided, immersive. Peter doesn't receive a lecture, he receives a tour. That tour structure is the key to understanding how the text functions. It moves through different zones of the afterlife, the way a guide moves a visitor through different rooms of a building. You see one scene, understand what it represents, then move to the next. The geography is cosmic in scale, but the logic is almost architectural. Heaven is here, hell is there, and within each region different populations are arranged according to what they did during their lives. The righteous are gathered in a place of extraordinary beauty and light, their suffering rewarded, their tears wiped away, their dignity restored. The wicked are in torment, and the torments are specific, tailored, calibrated to match the specific nature of each sin, with a kind of terrible precision that ancient audiences apparently found both horrifying and deeply satisfying. That moral logic, the mapping of sins to consequences, is one of the most distinctive features of the text, and one of the things that makes it feel different from earlier visions of the underworld. This isn't the shadowy, undifferentiated realm of the dead that you find in Homer. It's not even the relatively schematic afterlife of the Book of Revelation, which is more interested in cosmic warfare than in categorizing individual sinners. The Apocalypse of Peter is almost systematic in its approach. It builds a taxonomy of wrongdoing and matches each category to a punishment that echoes the original crime. Murderers face a specific torment, blasphemers face another. Sexual transgressors, slanderers, those who oppressed the poor, those who abandoned children, those who persecuted the righteous, each group gets its own place in the landscape of punishment, and the consequences fit the crimes with an almost poetic logic. We'll spend several sections going through those in detail, because the specifics are genuinely revealing about what this community cared about and what it feared. Now, it's worth flagging how this differs from the later medieval tradition of hell tours that most people are more familiar with, because the Apocalypse of Peter is sometimes described as a direct ancestor of texts like Dante's Inferno, and while that connection is real and important, the differences matter too. The medieval tradition tends to be more elaborate, more hierarchically organized, more concerned with precise gradations of sin and punishment. Dante's hell is a beautifully engineered machine. The Apocalypse of Peter is something rawer than that. It's less concerned with systematic theology and more concerned with emotional impact. It wants you to feel the justice of what you're seeing, to recognize specific sins in specific torments, to understand that the divine accounting is real and detailed, and inescapable. The later medieval imagination refined and institutionalized something that began here in a much more direct, immediate, almost visceral form. The family resemblance is clear, but knowing where something begins also tells you how much it changed along the way. There are several motifs running through the Apocalypse of Peter that are worth tracking from this point forward, because they'll keep appearing as we work through the text section by section. The first is angels. Angels are present throughout as executors of divine judgment, guides through the cosmic landscape, and sometimes as figures of comfort. Their function is not decorative. They're structural to how the text understands justice. Divine will is carried out through specific agents, which means the punishment of sinners is not random or impersonal. It is deliberate, administered, witnessed. The second motif is cosmic geography. The afterlife in this text has a spatial logic. There is a place where the righteous dwell and a place where the wicked suffer, and the text is interested in describing both with enough specificity that you could almost draw a map. That geography encodes a theological claim. The cosmos is morally organized. Location reflects spiritual state. Where you end up is a direct function of who you were. That's not an obvious assumption, but it's a deeply important one for understanding how this text thinks. The third motif is the public exposure of hidden sins. This is one of the most psychologically potent elements of the text, and one that ancient audiences would have responded to immediately. Many of the sinners in the Apocalypse of Peter are people who concealed their wrongdoing during their lifetimes. They presented one face to the world and did something else in private. The afterlife strips that concealment away entirely. Everything hidden becomes visible. Every sin is named, located, displayed, and punished in proportion to its nature. For a community that felt vulnerable to the hypocrisy and the power of those around them, that was not a minor theological point. It was a profound reassurance that the universe sees what human institutions miss. One more thing you need to know before we go further, and this is important enough that we'll return to it repeatedly throughout this video. The Apocalypse of Peter does not exist in a single clean, definitive version. We have two main forms of the text, a Greek fragment discovered in Egypt in 1886, and a longer Ethiopic version that survived in a different manuscript tradition. Those two versions agree on a great deal, but they also differ in ways that are significant and sometimes startling. The order of certain scenes varies. The descriptions of some punishments differ in their specifics, and in at least one critically important passage, the two versions seem to say almost opposite things about whether the punishments of hell are permanent, or whether divine mercy might ultimately reach even the condemned. That last discrepancy is not a minor textual footnote. It touches on one of the most explosive theological questions in all of early Christianity, and it explains some of why this text generated controversy rather than simply comfort. When we get to that section of the video, you'll see how a single difference between manuscripts can open up an entire world of theological argument that has never fully been resolved. For now, hold on to the basic shape: visionary literature, guided tour, moral taxonomy, cosmic geography, sins revealed and punished in precise correspondence to their nature, multiple manuscript versions that don't entirely agree. That's the skeleton of what we're working with. Everything else, the specific scenes, the historical context, the manuscript drama, the centuries of influence, all of it hangs off that basic structure. And the historical context matters enormously, because this text didn't emerge from nowhere. It was produced by a specific community, in a specific moment under specific pressures. Understanding that moment is what allows us to read the text as more than a curiosity. It's what makes it a window into something real. So let's go there next. If you time-travelled into the 2nd century and walked into a random Christian gathering, you would not find Christianity as a neat, unified package with an agreed-on creed and a standardized Bible sitting on a lectern. You would find a movement in motion. fragmented, experimental, full of arguments about who counted as a real Christian and what following Jesus actually meant. Some groups read what would later become the New Testament alongside Jewish scriptures and texts like the Book of Enoch. Others cherished Gospels and revelations that never made it into the later canon. Some believers insisted that to be a Christian you had to keep most of the Jewish law. Others argued you absolutely didn't. Some communities leaned mystical, some ethical, some philosophical, some ecstatic. The lines between Christian, Jewish and pagan were blurry, and everybody was trying to sharpen them. That's the world the Apocalypse of Peter belongs to. It's not a product of a settled church giving you a clear official doctrine of heaven and hell. It's a product of contested space, where communities are still carving out their identity and using every tool they have, including terrifying and comforting visions of the afterlife, to do that work. The external situation only made that more urgent. Christians in the 2nd century did not experience non-stop, empire-wide persecution the way later legends sometimes make it sound. But they did live with the real possibility of targeted violence, local crackdowns, social exclusion and slander. They were a small, strange minority, whose refusal to sacrifice to the gods of the city or the emperor looked like treason, atheism and moral danger, all rolled into one. In that kind of environment, justice is a live question. If the empire has the power to torture and kill your friends in public, and then throw a victory party afterward, what do you do with that? How do you live with the anger, the grief, the apparent triumph of people who seem to be getting away with everything? One answer is you imagine a different court, a cosmic one. You tell and retell stories in which the social order is reversed, and the hidden truth is finally revealed. That's exactly what apocalyptic texts offer. They take the moral contradictions of daily life and project them onto an ultimate screen. That's why afterlife tours like the Apocalypse of Peter were not just horror entertainment. They were tools for endurance. When you see, in the mind's eye, persecutors being punished by angels or the poor and oppressed being comforted in radiant fields, you're not just being informed about metaphysics. You're being given reasons to stay loyal, to keep going, to refuse to blend back into the safe majority. This is where martyrdom culture matters. By the mid-2nd century, stories of Christians who had been killed for their faith were already circulating. Communities gathered at their graves, celebrated the anniversaries of their deaths, preserved accounts of their trials. These martyrs weren't just tragic losses. They were held up as athletes of faith, proof that loyalty to Christ was worth more than life itself. But that only works if death is not the end of the story. The more a community praises martyrdom, the more it needs a robust imagination of what happens after the executioner swings the sword. You need to picture the martyr vindicated, crowned, honoured. You need to picture the judge who condemned them standing before a different judge later on. You need a cosmos in which the scales actually balance. That's the emotional atmosphere the Apocalypse of Peter breathes. You can feel it in how intensely it focuses on persecutors, on hypocritical leaders, on those who harmed the vulnerable and seemed to escape consequences. The text doesn't have to mention specific Roman officials or specific martyrdoms. The readers can supply those faces on their own. The vision gives them the other half of the story. And this doesn't just shape how you think about enemies. It shapes how you think about yourself. Because apocalyptic expectation, the sense that history is racing toward a decisive unveiling, puts pressure on ethical behaviour inside the group as well. If you believe that the end could come at any time, that there is a detailed divine record of your actions, that your body and your choices are going to be unveiled in a very literal way that changes the feel of ordinary life, moral choices stop being private preferences and become moves in a cosmic drama. That's one reason apocalyptic literature is so good at boundary setting. It doesn't just say don't be like the outsiders. It shows you in stomach-churning detail What happens to outsiders understood not as ethnic others, but as people whose lives contradict the way of Jesus. Exploiters, abusers, mockers of the poor, corrupters of the innocent. By mapping sins to punishments, the text is also mapping social space. These are not our people. These are, at the same time, it's drawing the inner boundary line. Just because you're physically inside the community doesn't mean you're safe. Hidden hypocrisy, secret exploitation, pious talk covering for cruel behavior, those are exactly the kinds of things the Apocalypse of Peter loves to expose on Judgment Day. So the vision does double work. It warns against external pressure and internal corruption in the same breath. None of this appeared from nowhere. Christian apocalyptic writing is deeply indebted to Jewish traditions that were already centuries old. Texts like Daniel, 1 Enoch, 4 Ezra, and 2 Baruch had already developed the basic grammar, heavenly journeys, angelic guides, tours of the underworld, symbolic beasts, end-time judgment, resurrection, rewards, punishments. In some of those Jewish texts you already see specific afterlife punishments assigned to particular kinds of sinners, and you see the same concern with persecuted righteous people waiting for God to set things right. There's a family resemblance that's impossible to miss. But the Christian versions are not just photocopies. They take that inherited grammar and plug in distinctly Christian concerns: loyalty to Jesus as Messiah, conflict with imperial cults, arguments over wealth and renunciation, anxieties over community discipline. The Apocalypse of Peter is using a Jewish apocalyptic toolkit to answer Christian questions. You can see that in the specific sins the text cares about. When the vision lingers on sins of speech, slander, false teaching, blasphemy, it's not just fretting about abstract lying. In a fragile minority movement, words can split communities, hand people over to authorities, or hollow out the faith from within. The idea that every malicious word will be exposed and judged is not just a threat. It's a way of saying this, right here, is deadly serious. What you say about others and about God can destroy. The same with sexuality. The punishments attached to adultery, seduction, infanticide, and sexual violence are intense and graphic. That reflects broader Greco-Roman anxieties about sex, honour, and the family, but is also very specifically Christian. These communities are trying to distinguish themselves from both permissive and exploitative sexual norms around them. The vision doesn't offer a detached code of conduct. It burns alternative futures into the imagination. Self-control, chastity, care for children and vulnerable women, those aren't just recommended virtues. They're the visible markers of which side of the ultimate divide you're on. Wealth works the same way. The Apocalypse of Peter reserves some of its fiercest judgments for rich people who ignored the poor, for those who hoarded while others starved. In a world with no social safety net, where the church often functioned as a support network for widows, orphans, and the sick, that's not an abstract critique of greed. It's policing behaviour that could make or break the survival of the group. To give generously to the poor is to strengthen the body. To exploit them is to ally yourself with the persecutors, even if you say the right prayers on Sunday. And then there's hypocrisy. People who look righteous in public and live differently in private. If your community has no police force, no standardized legal system, no real power in the larger society, it is especially vulnerable to charismatic, manipulative, or two-faced leaders. The Apocalypse of Peter's obsession with the public exposure of hidden sins is a way of disarming that threat. Even if you evade human scrutiny now, the text insists you will not evade it forever. That conviction can stabilize a community that otherwise has very little recourse. Once you see all this, you start to notice something important. For a text like the Apocalypse of Peter, its social function is at least as important as its precise authorship details. Whether or not the historical Peter composed it, and we'll get to that question, it clearly speaks with a Petrine voice on purpose. It puts this detailed moral map and this terrifying, comforting cosmic tour in the mouth of a foundational apostle so that its guidance carries maximum weight. because what the community needs is not just information about the afterlife. It needs formation. It needs a shared story about who they are, who their enemies are, what counts as faithfulness, and what will finally be done about all the injustice they see and experience. The Apocalypse of Peter answers those needs in Technicolor, which raises the next big question. If this text was so compelling, so useful, so widely read, why didn't it end up as part of the standard New Testament? To understand that, we have to step away from the world that produced it and look at the arguments over who actually wrote it and when. When you finally turn to the question, okay, but did Peter actually write this? You're stepping into another kind of apocalyptic fog. The text itself speaks as if Peter is the visionary. Later lists of books sometimes treat it as Peter's revelation. But when you ask how, historically, a detailed Greek afterlife tour text got from a Galilean fisherman in the 30s to Christian communities across the Mediterranean a century later, the ground gets soft very fast. To make sense of that, you have to understand a habit that was completely normal in the ancient world and feels like outright fraud to modern readers: pseudepigraphy. In our world, if you publish something under someone else's name, that's plagiarism or identity theft. In the ancient Mediterranean, especially in religious and philosophical circles, writing as a revered figure was often seen as a way of honouring their authority and extending their teaching into new situations. Disciple schools did this. Students of a famous philosopher might compose treatises using his voice, not because they were trying to scam people, but because they believed they were faithfully channeling his thought. Jewish apocalyptic writers did it too. Texts like 1 Enoch, 4 Ezra, and 2 Baruch speak in the first person as ancient heroes who historically didn't sit down and write those books. The whole genre leans on the conceit, let me show you a heavenly vision granted to a figure you already trust. Early Christians inherited that toolkit. You can see it in the sheer number of Petrine writings that appear in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Gospel of Peter, the Acts of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the so-called Kerygma of Peter, and more. Some of these are almost certainly not by the historical Peter, and yet they're not random fakes either. They're attempts by later communities to answer new questions with the voice of an apostle people already recognized as a foundational witness. So when the Apocalypse of Peter presents Peter asking Jesus questions and seeing the afterlife, most scholars see that as a literary device, not a literal transcript. It's part of the genre's DNA. Once you recognize that, the question shifts. Instead of, did Peter personally write this? It becomes, when and where did someone or some group find it useful to speak as Peter in this particular way? That's where dating comes in, and it's trickier than it sounds. We don't have an autograph, no original scroll with Peter, Apostle of Jesus, written in fading ink at the bottom. What we have are later manuscript copies in different languages with variations. So scholars triangulate using 3 main kinds of evidence: language, theology, and reception. Language first. The earliest recoverable form of the text is in Greek. The vocabulary and style don't look like the rough, Semitic-influenced Greek you might expect from a first-generation Galilean. Instead, it reads like the Greek of a later, more Hellenized Christian author familiar with Jewish apocalyptic traditions and comfortable in the wider Greco-Roman literary world. There are also links in phrasing and imagery to other 2nd century Christian writings. When punishments are described with certain stock expressions, when heaven is pictured with particular turns of phrase, you can line them up with texts like the Sibylline Oracles, the Shepherd of Hermas, or 2 Clement. The overlap suggests a shared environment, not an unmediated voice from the 30s. Then theology, the Apocalypse of Peter, presupposes a church that already has some structure, some memory of persecution, and active debates about wealth, hypocrisy, and the fate of sinners. It doesn't sound like something emerging in the first messy decade after Jesus' death. It sounds like a document produced by a community that has had time to develop patterns of leadership, to experience betrayal and internal conflict, to wrestle with questions like, what happens to Christians who sin badly? And, is there any hope for them after judgment? Its Christology, the way it talks about Jesus, is clearly high. Jesus is the authoritative judge of the living and the dead, enthroned in glory. But it doesn't wade into later, very technical debates about Christ's two natures or the Trinity that we see in the 3rd and 4th centuries, that places it in a kind of sweet spot after the earliest apostolic period, before the full flowering of later doctrinal controversy. And then reception. This is one of the most concrete data points we have. By around 180 CE, the church historian Eusebius tells us, a writer named Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, knew texts circulating under Peter's name. Another early writer, the Muratorian Fragment, probably from late 2nd century Rome, mentions an apocalypse of Peter as something some Christians wanted to read publicly in church, even if not everyone agreed it should be scripture. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, quotes the apocalypse of Peter and treats it with respect. All of that tells us the text was already composed, copied and circulating by the late 100s. So it's very unlikely to be younger than that. On the other end, the text seems to be in conversation with Jewish apocalyptic writings and with the memory of persecutions that fit better in the mid-2nd century than in the 1st. Many scholars therefore land on a rough window, somewhere between about 100 and 150 CE for an original Greek composition, maybe a little earlier or later depending on which details you emphasize. But this is where internal clues start to tug scholars in different directions. Look closely at how the afterlife is pictured. The punishments are very concrete, even anatomical, eyes plucked out, tongues tormented, bodies hung by specific body parts that sinned. The rewards are likewise physical, shining bodies, fragrant places, lush fields. This fits a moment when Christian thinkers are pushing back against more spiritualizing tendencies, ideas that the body is gross, matter is bad, and salvation is purely about escaping to an immaterial realm. The Apocalypse of Peter insists, no, the body matters. What you do in the body will be judged in the body. The concern lines up with 2nd century battles against certain Gnostic movements, which tended to downplay bodily resurrection and ethical responsibility in this world. If you already have groups arguing that what happens in the flesh doesn't really matter, a graphic tour of bodily rewards and torments makes sense as a counter-argument. You also see internal concern with church leaders who exploit the flock, with rich Christians who ignore the poor, and with people who claim to belong to the community, but live double lives. Those emphases match anxieties we know from 2nd century writers like Ignatius, Polycarp, and the author of The Shepherd of Hermas. It's a world where the Jesus movement is no longer an obscure sect of a few dozen people. It's a growing network of communities with real money, real social stakes, and real potential for abuse. All of that nudges the date away from Peter's lifetime and into the period when those social patterns had actually emerged. At the same time, there are hints that the text itself may not be a single uniform block. Some sections, especially the tight, almost formulaic list of sins and punishments, feel like they could have existed as a smaller hell tour tradition, that someone later expanded by adding introductions, heavenly scenes, or more theological reflections. That's where competing theories come in. Some scholars argue for a single author composing the whole thing more or less at once, perhaps drawing on oral traditions about Peter and on Jewish visionary texts. Others see signs of layering, maybe a core apocalypse used in preaching or catechesis, later edited to emphasize particular debates, like the possibility of mercy after judgment, which shows up more strongly in some versions of the text than others. On that reading, what we call the Apocalypse of Peter is really a kind of living document, adjusted as it moves through communities with different concerns. The Ethiopic version, for example, preserves lines about Christ, eventually granting rest even to those in torment, while some Greek witnesses mute or omit that kind of universalist hint. That doesn't just affect theology, it affects how you date and reconstruct the text. Is the merciful ending original and later trimmed, or a later softening added on? Different answers push you to different timelines. Underneath all this, there's a basic humility scholars have to keep. Some things simply can't be proven. We don't have a chain of custody from Peter to our manuscripts. We don't know the name, location, or exact circumstances of the original author or redactor. We're inferring from patterns of vocabulary, from parallels with other texts, from how church writers talk about it generations later. It's like trying to reconstruct a lost city from scattered foundations and a few travel diaries. But even if you can't put a precise date stamp on the Apocalypse of Peter, you can say why Peter is the right mask for it to wear. Peter is one of the inner circle disciples. In the Gospels, he's the one who witnesses the Transfiguration, who sees Jesus radiant in glory with Moses and Elijah. He's the one who confesses Jesus as the Messiah, the one Jesus calls the Rock, the one, in some traditions, who dies a martyr in Rome. Put an afterlife vision in his mouth, and you're doing several things at once. You're claiming apostolic authority. This isn't just some visionary down the street. This is the man who walked with Jesus from the beginning. You're claiming proximity to the earthly Jesus. Peter could plausibly say, "The Lord himself showed me this," and you're claiming pastoral weight. Peter is remembered as a shepherd of the flock, someone who wept over his own failures and strengthened others. If Peter is the one warning you about hypocrisy, wealth, persecution, and the fate of sinners, you're supposed to listen. So, whether or not the historical Peter ever heard anything like the specific scenes in this text, the Petrine voice is doing crucial work. It wraps this community's anxieties and hopes in apostolic credibility. And this is where dating really matters. If the Apocalypse of Peter is a mid-2nd century work, then its vivid hell and heaven are not the earliest Christian imagination of the afterlife. They're part of a developing conversation. They're in dialogue with older Jewish apocalypses, with emerging Gnostic cosmologies, with Greco-Roman philosophical ideas about the soul, and with other Christian visionary texts that are starting to appear around the same time. Place it too early, and you might treat it as a direct window into the preaching of the first apostles. Place it too late, and you might miss the way it stands near the front edge of Christian reflection on post-mortem judgment. Getting the rough time frame right helps you see what it's borrowing and what it's inventing. It also shapes how you read its later influence. If it's circulating widely by 150 CE, it has time to shape other apocalypses, to be quoted in sermons, to leave its fingerprints on how ordinary believers picture the fate of the righteous and the wicked, long before the church finally settles which books count as scripture. And that brings us to the next puzzle. If this early authoritative-sounding Petrine vision was so beloved, how did it end up in the almost but not quite pile when Christians finally drew the line around the New Testament? To answer that, we have to follow the text through its manuscripts, its disappearances, and its surprising rediscoveries. When you follow the Apocalypse of Peter into the manuscript record, the ground that was already a bit squishy turns into a patchwork of islands. There is no single, pristine book of Peter's Apocalypse sitting in a glass case somewhere. What we actually have looks more like a set of surviving puzzle pieces from different print runs of the same story, in different languages, copied by different communities, at different times, with slightly different ideas of what the ending should be. So, if you want to know what this text was, you have to start where historians always start, with the witnesses. The first big witness is Greek. That makes sense. The earliest form of the text we can get back to is Greek. The world of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd century ran on Greek. But even here, we're not dealing with full, unbroken codices. One key piece showed up in the late 19th century at a place called Akhmim in Egypt. Archaeologists found a grave, opened it, and discovered a small codex with several texts copied together. Among them was a long Greek fragment of a Petrine apocalypse, For the first time, modern scholars could read big chunks of this work: punishments, rewards, Jesus explaining the fate of sinners. It was like suddenly finding several missing chapters of a book you'd only known from quotations. Except this Akhmim text turned out not to be the whole story. It preserves major portions of the Hell Torah, some heavenly material, and bits that match what early Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria had quoted. But it's not complete, and it also includes things that don't show up in other witnesses, like certain narrative transitions and details about the crucifixion. So already you can see this is a version of the Apocalypse of Peter, not the Apocalypse of Peter. Other Greek fragments exist too in more tattered form. Papyri from Oxyrhynchus and elsewhere preserve smaller snippets, lines or paragraphs that overlap with the Akhmim text or with later translations. Each one is like a shard of pottery with a few recognizable words. On their own they're tiny, but together they help confirm that there really was a Greek apocalypse circulating under Peter's name, and that it had a recognizable core. Then there's the other major witness, the Ethiopic tradition. Centuries after Greek had faded from everyday use in many Christian communities, the Ethiopian church was still copying, translating, and reading apocalyptic literature. In Ge'ez, the classical Ethiopic language, we have a fuller version of the Apocalypse of Peter than anything preserved in Greek. It includes more developed heavenly scenes, a more elaborate conclusion, and in many manuscripts, those tantalizing lines about Christ eventually granting rest to the damned. This Ethiopic version isn't just a translation of the Akhmim text. It preserves episodes and phrases that the Akhmim fragment either doesn't have or doesn't match exactly. That suggests both a drawing directly or indirectly on some earlier Greek form, or forms that we no longer possess. Think of two cousins who both take after a grandparent you've never met. You can compare them, notice shared features, and infer something about the older generation, even if the original is gone. Modern understanding of the Apocalypse of Peter has basically lurched forward every time a new witness like this appears. When Clement of Alexandria quoted the text in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, he only gave snippets. Later, medieval lists of books mention an Apocalypse of Peter, but don't quote it at length. For a long time, scholars knew the title and a few lines, but the book itself looked lost. The Akhmim discovery in the 1800s changed that. Suddenly, editors could publish a Greek text. Translators could render it into modern languages. Theologians could see just how graphic and specific its punishments were. People started asking, is this the same apocalypse Clement used? How does it relate to other Hell Torah texts? Then, as Ethiopic manuscripts were studied and edited in the 20th century, a new twist emerged. The Ge'ez version contained that startling Universalist-sounding finale, a scene where the righteous beg for mercy on behalf of the damned, and Christ appears to agree that after a time, he will free them. That passage doesn't appear in the Akhmim Greek. Early editors had to decide, is this a later Ethiopian expansion? Or did the Greek tradition represented by Akhmim abridge an older, more merciful ending? Each new edition, each new papyrus, forced scholars to redraw the outline of what they thought the Apocalypse of Peter was. You can see the process in the history of printed critical texts. Early editors sometimes treated Akhmim as basically definitive. Later ones, comparing Greek fragments, Ethiopic versions and ancient quotations, started to talk more cautiously about Greek recension, Ethiopic recension, and so on. Along the way, you get a crash course in how ancient texts change when they travel. Omissions are the simplest. A scribe skips a line because two sentences end with the same word, and his eye jumps. A leaf of a manuscript goes missing before the copyist ever sees it. Suddenly, a scene is shorter, a transition is rougher, a speech seems to end abruptly. Later readers might not realize anything is missing. They just read the shortened version as if it were complete. Additions are more creative. A scribe glosses a difficult line in the margin. This means the souls of the wicked will suffer in Hades, and the next scribe, copying the manuscript, pulls that gloss into the main text. Another community, bothered by how harsh the punishments sound, adds a softening line. But the Lord is merciful and knows the weakness of humans. Over time, those little adjustments accumulate. Two communities, both convinced they're preserving Peter's vision faithfully, can end up with subtly different Peters. Then there are harmonizations. A scribe who knows the canonical Gospels very well might unconsciously smooth the apocalypse of Peter, so it sounds more like Matthew or Luke. Phrases drift. A unique turn of speech becomes something more familiar. Or, on the doctrinal level, a passage that seems to suggest eventual relief for the damned might be brought into line with a stricter eternal torment theology by trimming a few sentences or rephrasing a verb. This is where translation really bites. The move from Greek to ge'ez isn't just word swapping. Greek verbs carry tense and aspect in ways ge'ez handles differently. A future-looking hope they will obtain mercy can slide toward a more conditional phrase. They might find mercy, depending on how you render it. A participle that in Greek implies being punished until might in another language get flattened into being punished forever, because the translator makes a choice, consciously or not, about what seems theologically right. Even basic terms like Hades, Gehenna, righteous, justified, and rest have slightly different flavours in different languages and church traditions. A Greek word that, in its original context, carries a sense of temporary custody can, in translation, pick up the weight of final condemnation. Multiply that by centuries of copying and preaching, and you can see how the same underlying scene might feel harsher or more hopeful depending on which version you read. So how do scholars reconstruct anything like an earlier apocalypse of Peter out of this? They do it the same way they reconstruct other ancient texts, by comparing all the surviving witnesses line by line, asking which readings look older, which look like they could have given rise to the others, and which seem shaped by later concerns. If a harsh reading could easily have been softened by a compassionate scribe, but a soft reading would be hard to imagine being hardened in a stricter direction that nudges you one way. If a complex, slightly awkward phrase in Greek becomes smooth and doctrinally tidy in Ethiopic, that suggests the awkward Greek is closer to the original. They also lean on external anchors. If Clement quotes a merciful line, we know that idea was in at least one 2nd century Greek copy. If later church writers criticize an apocalypse for being too soft on the damned, that tells you what they were reading. These external testimonies act like calibration marks against which you can test what our manuscripts say. But no matter how carefully you weigh the evidence, you can't get back to an autograph with absolute confidence. At best, you sketch a likely family tree, a Greek ancestor text, probably composed in the early to mid-2nd century, branching into different recensions, one leading to the Akmim-type Greek, another feeding into an early translation tradition that eventually becomes the Ethiopic. And that uncertainty isn't just a technical footnote. It matters for everything else we're going to talk about. When we look at the heaven scenes in a later section, the lush fields, the shining bodies, the reversal of fortunes between rich and poor, we have to keep in mind that the Ethiopic version sometimes adds colour and expansion that the Greek doesn't have. Are those details original, or the work of a translator with a vivid imagination? When we wrestle with the universalist-sounding lines about mercy after judgment, we're moving right into the zone where Greek and Ethiopic diverge most dramatically. Whether you think the hopeful ending was cut out of some Greek copies or added in some Ethiopic ones, will shape how you read the whole message of the book. Even the catalogue of punishments, the Hell Tour itself, shows signs of editing and rearranging. Some manuscripts group sins differently or adjust which body part gets punished for which offence. That's not random, It reflects how different communities wanted to emphasize different moral dangers. So, as we turn to the text's content, it's heaven, it's hell, it's moral imagination. We're never just reading one fixed script. We're listening to a chorus of slightly different performances of the same song. Some in Greek, some in Ge'ez, some preserved only in quotations and fragments. The power of the Apocalypse of Peter comes partly from what all those voices agree on. But some of the most fascinating questions lie in what they don't. If the manuscript story shows us a chorus of slightly different versions, the canon story shows us something even stranger. Some of those voices got invited onto the main stage of Christian scripture, and some were left in the wings. And the Apocalypse of Peter is one of those texts that spent a long time standing in the doorway. To get why, you have to let go of the idea that there was ever a single meeting where bishops sat down, held up books, and stamped them, Bible or banned. That's a much later imagination. What actually happened looks more like that meta-population structure we talked about earlier, but with books instead of humans. Different churches in different cities had their own little libraries. Scrolls and codices circulated through networks of friendship, trade, and missionary work. One community in Egypt might be reading the Gospel of Matthew, the letters of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Apocalypse of Peter in their Sunday gatherings. A community in Asia Minor might know some of those, plus other writings, and not have seen Peter's Apocalypse at all. Canon in this early period isn't a fixed list. It's a pattern of usage. Which texts get copied a lot? Which ones get read aloud in worship? Which ones are quoted as authoritative when bishops or teachers argue about doctrine? Over time, those patterns harden. Certain books become the ones everybody knows. Others remain local favourites. A few get quietly dropped. Into that messy, living world, the Apocalypse of Peter arrives, and at first it does really well. We know this because 2nd century writers don't just know it exists, they treat it as worth listening to in public. Clement of Alexandria seems to have valued it enough to quote it alongside what later became New Testament texts. The Muratorian Fragment, a late 2nd century list of books used in at least one Roman church, says that some will not have read the Apocalypse of Peter in church, but then immediately adds that some among us do read it. That little aside is a goldmine. It tells you two things at once. First, this wasn't some fringe pamphlet passed under the table. It was being read among us, in Christian assemblies, out loud to ordinary believers. The lurid punishments and heavenly rewards were being performed in community, not just pondered by scholars. Second, even by the late 2nd century, not everyone was comfortable with that. There were already Christians saying, "We don't read that in church," and others saying, "Well, we do. That's the zone the Apocalypse of Peter lived in for a long time. Not banned, but disputed." Banned implies an official prohibition, a council decree, a list of forbidden books. In the first few centuries, you don't really see that in a clear, universal way. What you see instead is a spectrum. At one end, you have texts that are basically undisputed. The 4 Gospels, the core letters of Paul, Acts. They get quoted all over the place. Church fathers call them Scripture without hesitation. They show up again and again in lists of accepted books. In the middle, you have a grey band of writings that some communities love and others side-eye. The Apocalypse of Peter lives here, along with texts like the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Revelation of John in some regions, and a handful of other apocalypses and letters. These aren't banned, they're debated. Some bishops endorse them. Others are cautious. Some lists include them among useful, but not fully canonical books. At the far end, you have works that are explicitly rejected or attacked, Gospels that radically rework the story of Jesus, revelations used by groups mainstream bishops label heretical. Those can eventually get something like a real ban in certain regions. The Apocalypse of Peter never really lives in that last category. It isn't treated like a Gnostic manifesto. It's much closer to non-canonical but influential. And that's an important category. It covers texts that shaped how ordinary Christians imagined God, judgment, hell, and heaven, even after they stopped being read in the core Sunday lectionary. A book can be incredibly popular, copied for centuries, mined for imagery by preachers and artists, and still never make the final cut as scripture. So why did some books climb into the canon while others hovered just outside? Later Christian writers, looking back, give us a rough set of criteria, even if nobody in the 2nd century was using them as a neat checklist. One big one is apostolicity. Does the text come from an apostle, or at least from a close companion of an apostle? A writing attributed to Peter has an obvious head start here. Calling your book the Apocalypse of Peter is like slapping from the desk of the CEO on a memo. It signals authority, but early Christians weren't completely naive about names on title pages. They knew there were forged apostolic works, so apostolicity quickly becomes not just whose name is on the cover, but does this actually sound like what we think Peter or Paul taught? Which slides you into the second criterion, orthodoxy. Orthodoxy in this setting doesn't mean agrees with a fully formed creed. The creeds are still being hammered out. It means does this text line up with what the mainstream churches, spread across different regions, recognize as the core story about God, Christ, salvation, and the future? That leads straight to the third big word, Catholicity. Not Roman Catholic in the later sense, but small c Catholic. Universal, broadly accepted. Is a text known and used across the network, or is it mostly a regional favourite? When you see a book quoted in Alexandria, Rome, North Africa and Syria that feels more Catholic, when it mostly shows up in Egypt, say it's easier for bishops elsewhere to treat it as optional. The fourth factor, often overlooked, is liturgical usefulness. Can you read this in church without confusing or misleading people? Does it build up the community? Does it fit smoothly into the cycle of readings and prayers that structure Christian worship? The Apocalypse of Peter scores high on some of these and lower on others. Apostolicity by attribution, check. Orthodoxy, mixed. Large chunks of the book line up quite well with what many 2nd and 3rd century Christians believed. Jesus as judge, the resurrection of the dead, rewards for the righteous, punishments for the wicked, heavy stress on moral transformation. That's pretty standard fare. But then you hit those edges. The way sins are mapped onto specific bodily tortures, the almost mechanical vision of divine retribution, and in at least some forms of the text, that hint of mercy after judgment. Theologians could and did disagree about how comfortable they were with all that. Catholicity, also mixed. The book seems to have enjoyed real popularity in Egypt and surrounding regions. The Ethiopic tradition shows that variant forms of it were cherished and preserved far into the medieval period. But in some other centres of power, like Rome and later Constantinople, its profile gradually shrinks. Lists of canonical books in the 4th century tend not to include it. When church fathers mention it, they increasingly put it in the read for edification, not as scripture bucket. Liturgical usefulness may have been where the trouble really started. Imagine you're a bishop trying to shepherd a diverse, sometimes barely literate congregation. You need texts that will shape their faith, not just their nightmares. Revelation-style imagery is one thing. It's dense, symbolic, and gets interpreted in different ways. But the Apocalypse of Peter gives you a kind of tour brochure of hell, specific sins, specific body parts, specific torments. That vividness makes it an amazing moral teaching tool. You can see why some communities would read it to catechumens, to new converts, to people who needed a jolt to take repentance seriously. You see those people hanging by their tongues? That's what happens to slanderers. The images stick. It also makes church leaders nervous. A text this graphic has the power to hijack the imagination. People might start thinking of salvation almost entirely in terms of avoiding torture, rather than union with Christ. They might obsess over which precise punishment fits which sin, or start using the book's imagery to condemn their personal enemies. And if, on top of that, some copies end with a scene where the damned are eventually granted rest, now you've introduced ambiguity right at the point where bishops are trying to teach clear lines about judgment. When later canon lists and church orders start drawing firmer boundaries, you can feel that nervousness in how they classify apocalyptic texts. Revelation of John squeaks in, but not everywhere, and not without debate. Other apocalypses get pushed aside as not to be read publicly in the church. Not because they're all heretical, but because they're seen as too speculative, too open to wild interpretation, too likely to feed the wrong instincts. Bishops and synods don't create the canon out of nothing. They respond to what people are already reading. But once they start issuing lists, these are the books we recognize as scripture. These others are useful to read. These should be avoided. They shape what gets copied in monasteries, what gets read in liturgy, what survives. The Apocalypse of Peter ends up in that middle category in many places, valued, sometimes copied along with scripture, but tagged as not canonical. Over generations that status has a cumulative effect. When parchment is expensive and copyists have to choose, they prioritize the books everyone agrees on. Grey zone texts slip more easily into the category of extra reading and eventually into obscurity. So you're left with a tension that runs all through the reception of this book. On the ground, among ordinary believers, the Apocalypse of Peter functioned as a powerful moral teaching tool. Its heaven and hell scenes gave shape to hope and fear, to what justice might look like when nobody gets away with anything. In the councils and in the letters of bishops, you can feel growing concern about doctrine and authority. Who really speaks for Peter? How graphic is too graphic? How much imaginative detail about the afterlife is helpful? And how much risks distorting the gospel? That tension is exactly what we're going to be living inside for the rest of this video. Because once you see how precarious the book's canonical status always was, how beloved it could be at the grassroots, and how cautious leaders became about putting it on the same level as the Gospels, you start to read its heaven and hell scenes differently, not as neutral descriptions, but as contested moral visions. So let's step into those visions. We'll start on the bright side, the lush fields, the shining bodies, the upside-down social order of the Apocalypse of Peter's heaven, where the meek and the mutilated finally get their turn to be whole. The tour of heaven in the Apocalypse of Peter is short compared to the long march through hell. But that's part of the design. It's like a flash of light before your eyes adjust to the dark. And that flash is doing a lot of work. First, it's consolation. You have to imagine who might have been hearing this text read aloud. Not emperors, not landowners sitting comfortably in marble villas. Most early Christians were ordinary people, many were poor. Some were enslaved, some were widows, or manual labourers or migrants in overcrowded slums. Some had watched friends dragged away in persecution. Some had lost children. If all you give those people is a catalogue of torments for sinners, you haven't really given them good news. You've just told them that yes, the world is cruel, and God will be cruel too later. The heaven scenes push in the opposite direction. They say everything you were supposed to be ashamed of, everything the world used to beat you down, is going to be healed and honoured. The righteous in Peter's vision are often described in terms of purity. Not just sexual purity in the narrow sense, but a whole way of being uncorrupted. Clean garments, shining faces, bodies that are untouched by decay. In a world where most people stank of sweat and infection, and had maybe one set of clothes to their name, that's not just spiritual metaphor. It is sensory relief. Generosity gets rewarded too. You can feel, behind the imagery, a community where sharing food, money and time is hard, because nobody has much. The Apocalypse of Peter leans into that. Those who gave to the poor, who fed the hungry, who opened their homes, are depicted as dwelling in abundance. They are in gardens, orchards, places overflowing with life. Their lack in this world becomes overflowing plenty in the next. Then there's endurance. Faithfulness under pressure. In the background of almost every early Christian apocalypse is the possibility that being loyal to Christ might cost you. Reputation, security, sometimes your life. So heaven, for this audience, isn't just about moral cleanliness. It's about standing firm when that loyalty hurts. The text reflects that by linking reward to steadfastness. Those who did not deny, who confessed Christ, who didn't cave when neighbours mocked them or authorities threatened them, are the ones crowned, literally crowned. Crowns or garlands appear as a recurring motif, echoing both the imagery of athletic victory and the honours given to heroes in the Greco-Roman world. If you've never even been considered for an earthly honour, if the only crown you'll ever see is on coins bearing the emperor's face, then being pictured with a radiant crown in the presence of God is emotionally explosive. It tells you that your quiet, costly faithfulness, which nobody in your city notices, is in fact the thing that heaven is waiting to celebrate, that feeds directly into the great reversal logic that runs under the whole book. In the Gospels, Jesus talks about the last being first and the first last, about the poor being blessed, the rich worn. The Apocalypse of Peter takes that and turns it into scenery. The lowly are vindicated. People who were trampled, invisible, or literally mutilated in this life are shown whole, radiant, honoured. Meanwhile, the powerful who use their status to exploit, the wealthy who ignored the suffering around them, are, in the hell scenes, stripped of their power and subjected to the very kinds of harm they inflicted. Heaven isn't just a nice place, it's a moral counter-universe. The reversal is written into the landscape. The imagery of light, for example, isn't only about abstract holiness, it's about visibility and safety. The righteous live in a place saturated with light, sometimes described as brighter than the sun, sometimes as a kind of shimmering, gem-like glow. Light means you're seen. You're not hiding in shadows, not afraid of what might attack you in the dark. For people who lived by dim lamps and feared thieves, wild animals, or soldiers at night, a world of constant gentle light is a world where fear has been structurally removed. Fragrance plays a similar role. Ancient cities were not fragrant by modern standards. Rotting garbage, open sewers, animals, disease. When the text talks about paradisal fragrance, flowers, incense, the sweet smell of gardens, it's not decoration. It's the sensory opposite of a world that smells like death. The righteous breathe in life with every breath. Clothing imagery carries social meaning too. White garments, clean linen, bright robes, all of these say purity, yes, but also dignity. Clothes in the ancient world marked status. Only certain fabrics, colours, or decorations were allowed for certain ranks. In Peter's heaven, those hierarchies are flattened and inverted. The poor, the persecuted, the ones who never owned impressive garments are arrayed in splendour. And the crowns, in some versions, they're studded with flowers, in others with light. They're not just rewards, they are visible signs that this person ran the race and finished well. They carry the emotional weight of both vindication and belonging. You are now the kind of person who fits in this radiant company. If you know the New Testament well, you can hear echoes everywhere. The imagery of white robes and palm branches from Revelation, the crowns of righteousness in Paul's letters, the inheritance that can never fade in 1 Peter. The Apocalypse of Peter feels like it swims in the same symbolic pool. But it's not just copying Revelation and tacking on extra gore or extra comfort. The relationship is more complex. It's probably drawing on a shared reservoir of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic motifs: gardens, light, festal meals, angelic company, and then remixing them for its own pastoral goals. Where Revelation often wraps hope in thick layers of cosmic symbolism, New Jerusalem, Sea of Glass, Tree of Life, the Apocalypse of Peter tends to keep things more direct. The righteous look happy. They sing. They enjoy peace. Their bodies are healed. The focus is less on a transformed city and more on transformed people. And that straightforwardness matters because of what comes next in the book. The heaven scenes are deliberately placed before the long descent into punishments. They are the emotional counterweight. If you only had hell, the message could curdle into simple terror, obey or burn, with heaven first, and heaven painted as tactile, tender, and just. The fear of punishment is held inside a larger hope, that the universe itself is being set right, that goodness really will be worth it. In other words, the bright landscape isn't just there to make the dark seem darker. It's there to keep the dark from swallowing the whole story. You can almost imagine the effect in a house church setting. As the reader describes fragrant fields, shining garments, crowns, some people in the room are thinking of lost loved ones. Others are quietly asking, "Will I be there?" The hope rises. Then, when the punishments start, that hope doesn't disappear, it frames the horror. The message is not only don't be like these people, but also this is what God is rescuing you from and rescuing you for. And just like the punishment scenes, the reward scenes aren't frozen. They shift a bit across manuscripts. In some Ethiopic versions, the emphasis on glory and radiance is even stronger, longer descriptions of shining bodies, more language about joy and song. Other strands lean a bit more on moral categories, stressing purity and self-control. This suggests that different communities copying the text may have nudged the hope in directions that match their own concerns, one emphasizing bodily restoration and celebration, another stressing ethical transformation. These variations don't change the core picture, but they highlight an important point. Heaven in the Apocalypse of Peter is not generic bliss, it is a carefully constructed emotional engine. It consoles the wounded, lifts up the overlooked, promises honour to the faithful, and sets a baseline of goodness against which the later punishments will be judged. Because once you step past those luminous fields, the book turns and says, now look at what happens when people use their freedom to destroy that goodness. That's where we're headed next. We've seen how the text uses paradise to pull people forward with hope. Now we need to walk the other road, the hell tour, and see how it tries to push them away from sin with fear. And as we do, pay attention to how closely the tortures mirror the rewards, like a photographic negative. In Peter's Apocalypse, justice is always a mirror. When the text turns from heaven to hell, it doesn't just flip the mood. It flips the logic. If paradise is a moral counter-universe, hell in the Apocalypse of Peter is the workshop where that counter-universe gets built. It's not chaos. It's not demons just improvising whatever cruelty comes to mind. It's incredibly structured, and the first thing to notice about that structure is the basic rule of the place. Punishment matches the sin. Modern scholars sometimes call this the lex talionis of imagery, a kind of poetic Talion principle. Not simply an eye for an eye, but the way you used your body, your speech, your power becomes the way your body, speech and power are broken. So people who use their eyes for lust have their eyes attacked. People who use their tongues to deceive or blaspheme have their tongues tormented. Those who hoarded food are starved. Those who exploited the poor are hung up or trampled. It's not always one-to-one in a neat legal sense. The text isn't a statute book. But again and again the reader is invited to feel that the punishment is not arbitrary. It somehow fits. It reveals in exaggerated, horrifying form the moral shape that was already there. That mirroring logic does a lot of things at once. On one level, it satisfies a basic human craving for symmetry. In life, Consequences are often wildly disproportionate. Cruel people prosper, kind people suffer. In Peter's hell, that unfairness is rolled back. Every distortion of goodness gets a corresponding distortion in the body. On another level, it teaches. It's moral pedagogy dressed up as horror. To see why, you have to remember how shame worked in the ancient Mediterranean world. Modern Western cultures tend to lean heavily on internal guilt. I did something wrong, I feel bad inside. In antiquity, public honour and shame were at least as important. I did something wrong. My community sees me differently. My standing has dropped. The Apocalypse of Peter leans into that world. Most of the punishments are not private. They're on display. People are hung up, laid out, cast into rivers or pits where others can see them. Bodies are exposed, uncovered. There's almost always an audience. Angels, the righteous looking on, sometimes other damned souls. That public exposure is part of the punishment. If your sin was hidden, adultery nobody discovered, fraud nobody could prove, hell makes it visible. The secret becomes a spectacle. The text is telling its listeners, there is no such thing as a private vice. What you hide now will one day be the most visible thing about you. This fits a broader ancient strategy, shame as education. You don't just punish someone to hurt them. You punish them where others can watch, so the watching itself becomes a lesson. In that sense, the Hell Tour is a sermon in pictures. You walk through, you see what happened to people like this, and you're supposed to think about yourself, your own habits, your own secrets. Now, that brings up an uncomfortable question. How literally is this supposed to be taken? Is the Apocalypse of Peter describing literal eternal torture, a temporary purging, a symbolic vision designed to scare and persuade? The text itself is complicated. On the one hand, it absolutely leans into the language of finality. The judgment scene is framed as a once-for-all revelation of who people really are. Sinners are assigned to places. The torments are described in present tense, as if they're ongoing. There's no explicit clock ticking down. Some early Christian readers seem to have heard it that way, as a straightforward picture of what will happen to the wicked, forever. On the other hand, there are hints of something more flexible. Certain manuscripts, especially in Ethiopic, preserve a striking scene later on where the righteous actually beg for mercy on behalf of the damned. And in some versions, there's at least a suggestion that God might eventually listen. That doesn't sit easily with a hard eternal torment reading. Even within the punishment scenes, the language sometimes tilts toward process rather than pure stasis. Souls are chastised, corrected, shown the result of their deeds. That sounds at least like the language of discipline, not just pointless cruelty. It may be that the original author wasn't trying to nail down a metaphysical timetable so much as to create maximal moral seriousness. The pictures are stable and intense. How long they last is less clear. Ancient listeners, like modern ones, probably varied. Some would have heard it as literal prophecy. This is what God showed Peter. This is just how it will be. Others, especially more philosophically minded Christians influenced by Greek thought, might have heard it as allegory, the soul's vices tearing it apart, dramatized in bodily language. And then there's a middle option, rhetorical persuasion. On this view, the punishments function like political cartoons or courtroom speeches. You're not expected to think there will literally be, say, exactly this many hooks and exactly this number of snakes. You're supposed to feel in your body the horror of misusing your body. The details are vivid because vividness moves people. That brings us to a puzzle that often troubles modern readers. If this is about souls after death, why are the punishments so relentlessly physical? Bodies burn, bleed, hang, rot. Eyes are gouged, genitals are attacked. Mouths and stomachs are stuffed or starved. It's all very embodied. Part of that is simply the way ancient people thought. They did not, for the most part, imagine a clean separation between soul stuff and body stuff. Your soul was your life, your animating principle. Your body was how your soul acted in the world. If your soul was corrupt, your body showed it. And if God was going to set things right, bodies had to be involved. Early Christian texts, including the New Testament, already insist on bodily resurrection. Judgment happens not to detached ghosts, but to whole persons, re-embodied in some transformed way. The Apocalypse of Peter follows that line. It treats the body as the public record of a life. What you did with your hands, eyes, tongue, genitals, stomach, all of that is part of who you are. So in judgment, those same bodily parts become the canvas on which justice is written. There's also an accountability angle. A purely spiritual punishment, you will feel sad forever, doesn't obviously address the harm people actually do. When someone is beaten, raped, starved, or enslaved, the harm is bodily. The text answers that with bodily consequences. It's a way of saying, your victims did not suffer in the abstract, and neither will you. That bodily focus also serves another function in a largely illiterate culture. It makes the message memorable. You might forget a proverb about greed. You won't easily forget the image of a greedy person eating filth, or a deceiver having their tongue ripped out. The horror sticks now. For all its gore, hell in this text is not ruled by demons gone wild. It's highly ordered, and that order is angelic. Again and again, punishments are carried out by angels, not by Satan. Sometimes they're simply called angels, sometimes angels of punishment. They're not rebels against God. They're agents of divine justice. That's important. It tells the audience that what's happening here isn't a cosmic turf war. It's not good God versus bad devils, and the devils get to do whatever they want to the damned. It's one cosmos under one God, with a chain of command. Angels lead Peter and the righteous on the tour. Angels execute the sentences. Angels guard the boundaries between blessed and cursed regions. The whole thing feels almost bureaucratic. Different areas, different offences, different enforcers. That arrangement does two things rhetorically. It reassures the faithful that judgment, however terrifying, is not random, and it underlines a central claim of the book. The moral order is not a human invention. It is woven into the fabric of reality, policed at every level by beings who cannot be bribed or fooled. So as we walk through these scenes in the next few sections, we're not just collecting weird ancient horror images. We're watching a whole moral universe in motion. The text organizes sins in rough clusters, and those clusters matter. There are sins of the body, certain sexual behaviors, abortion and infanticide, gluttony and drunkenness. There are sins of speech, slander, false teaching, blasphemy. There are sins of power, exploiting the poor, hoarding wealth, betraying the vulnerable, persecuting believers. And there are sins of loyalty, idolatry, witchcraft, participation in pagan cults that the text sees as alliances with hostile powers. Each cluster gets its own zone in the tour. Each zone says something about what the community feared most, what it was trying to discourage, and how it understood the damage sin caused to the sinner, to other people, and to the relationship with God. When we zoom in on individual punishments later, it'll be easy to get lost in details. Hooks, worms, rivers of fire. But underneath the details, this is what the book is doing, mapping out a moral landscape. And how you take that map will depend on your interpretive choice. You can read the Apocalypse of Peter as a literal travel guide to the afterlife, a kind of early Christian inferno. This is what's coming. Get ready. That's how some ancient readers seem to have embraced it. You can read it as moral allegory, a dramatization of how vices twist the self, rendered in bodily language suited to a bodily people. Or you can read it as a piece of rhetoric, a passionate sermon in story form, using shock, fear, and the visceral imagination of its audience to push them away from certain behaviors and toward others. Those approaches aren't mutually exclusive. Early Christian hearers may have moved between them fluidly. What matters for us, as we move deeper into the Hell Tour, is to keep all three lenses in view. Because when you watch how the text punishes the tongue, the body, the purse, and the altar in the next sections, you're not just watching sadism. You're watching a community think out loud about what kind of people they want to be, and what kind of world they believe God is making, even if it has to be carved painfully out of the ruins of the old one. If you follow the tour the way the text lays it out, the first major zone you hit after the general overview is not about sex or money. It's about mouths, tongues, lips, throats, voices. The parts of us we use to speak. That's not accidental. In a tiny, besieged Christian community, words could be as dangerous as weapons. Maybe more. The Apocalypse of Peter obsessively circles around three kinds of speech sins: slander, false witness, and false teaching. Each one is a little different, but they all share the same basic feature. They break trust. Take slander and false witness first. In the vision, Peter sees people hanging by their tongues or having their mouths tormented, precisely because they use those tongues to slander the way of righteousness or to bear false witness against their neighbours. This is courtroom language. False witness is not just casual gossip. It's the kind of accusation that gets people in serious trouble, in some cases killed. For early Christians, that danger wasn't abstract. Their world ran on reputation. You lived in tight-knit networks, family, patrons, local associations, the little gathering of believers that met in someone's house. There was no privacy in the modern sense. Everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. In that environment, rumour could be lethal. A whisper that you were disloyal to the emperor, that you were participating in superstitious foreign rites, that you were avoiding the sacrifices to the gods that good citizens were supposed to perform. Any of that could put you on the radar of local officials. We have pagan sources accusing Christians of all kinds of things: cannibalism, incest, nighttime orgies. Were those rumours true? Virtually all scholars think no, but that's the point. A well-placed lie could turn neighbours into a mob. So when the Apocalypse of Peter shows slanderers dangling by their tongues, it isn't just engaging in creepy body horror. It's staging a kind of moral counter-trial. In life, their words hung over other people. In judgment, their tongues are what hang. The body part that launched accusations is itself accused, exposed, and punished. The same logic applies to internal slander, tearing down other believers. Early Christian letters constantly warn against backbiting, murmuring, malicious talk. Not because polite speech is a nice extra, but because these communities survived, if they survived at all, by mutual trust. You shared food, you pooled resources, you met in each other's homes at night when anything could happen. If you started to doubt that the person sitting next to you was really for you, the whole fragile experiment could collapse. The Apocalypse of Peter turns that social reality into horror theatre. To badmouth a brother or sister is not a minor social faux pas. It is an act that tears at the body of the community. So in hell, the body of the slanderer is what gets torn. Then the text shifts from everyday speech to speech, with a podium behind it, false teaching. This is where the punishments get even more intense, and the targets more specific. Some manuscript traditions of the Apocalypse of Peter are very clear. Teachers who twist the message, who lead others astray for gain, occupy some of the most terrifying spots in the landscape. They're not just punished for believing the wrong thing. They're punished for weaponizing the right words in the wrong way. Think of someone standing up in a house church, claiming to speak in Christ's name, but quietly arranging things so that honour, money, or sexual access flow toward them. Or toning down controversial parts of the message, so the local elites won't be offended, and their patronage keeps coming. On the surface, everything might look pious. The right vocabulary, the right prayers, the right slogans. That's where another favourite theme of the Apocalypse of Peter comes in: hypocrisy. In the Gospels, Jesus has his harshest lines not for ordinary sinners, but for hypocrites, people who say and do not do, who pray and give and fast to be seen by others, who tithe the smallest herbs but neglect justice and mercy. The Apocalypse of Peter takes that critique and runs it through the meat grinder. Hypocrites in this vision aren't just embarrassed. They're dismembered. They are sometimes shown wearing the outward marks of religious devotion: prayer, fasting, calling on the name of Christ, but their inner motives are exposed by their punishment. People who pretended to be shepherds but in practice devoured the flock are themselves devoured. Those who used sermons to crush the weak are themselves crushed. Those who made mouths for God but hearts for gold find that their mouths and guts are exactly where the judgment lands. Again, the mirroring logic is doing double work. It satisfies the craving for symmetry, but it also teaches the community how to think about leadership. Why do religious leaders get singled out so brutally? Because in early Christian moral imagination, speech from a position of authority is dangerous in a special way. Everybody's words matter, but if you stand up to interpret Scripture, to explain Christ's commands, to decide who belongs and who doesn't, your words can set entire life paths. Your misreading of reality doesn't just ruin your own life, it drags others with you. So the Apocalypse of Peter exaggerates in order to clarify. The false teacher is not just a guy with some wrong ideas. He is a kind of spiritual arsonist. Picture a small wooden village on the edge of an empire, mostly made of flammable material, surrounded by people who are at best suspicious and at worst hostile. Now imagine someone in that village lighting fires in the houses, then insisting they're bringing light in the name of God. That's how this text sees corrupt leadership, and that's why it places them under the harshest flames. This focus on speech lines up tightly with broader early Christian ethics. New Testament letters like James insist that the tongue is a fire, capable of burning down whole forests of relationships. Lying is not just bad manners, it's a reversion to an old way of life, a betrayal of the God who is truth. To follow Jesus is to become, in this moral world, a reliable person. Someone whose yes is yes and no is no. Someone who confesses Christ, even when it costs, and refuses to confess, lies, even when it would be convenient. The Apocalypse of Peter presents the negative of that ideal. Instead of honest speech that binds a community together, we get deceitful speech that tears it apart. Instead of teaching that builds hope, we get teaching that exploits fear. Instead of prophetic truth-telling that risks persecution, we get cowardly accommodation that feeds persecution of others. And then it asks its hearers, without ever quite saying it aloud, which side of this do you resemble? Even the way the punishments unfold carries that question. Words that killed reputations are answered by images of killing tongues. Voices that once sounded strong in the assembly are now reduced to cries. Mouths that once fed on the honour and offerings of others now vomit filth or gnash in hunger. It's as if the author is saying, in the end your speech will come back to you. Not in some mystical karmic cycle, but in the straight-line logic of a God who cares about what you did to each other. There's a social psychology here too. If you're trying to form a counter-cultural movement inside a powerful empire, you cannot afford to be casual about lies. You can't afford leaders who secretly serve their own interests. You can't afford rumour factories. Trust is your only real capital. You don't control the courts. You don't have armies. You don't have media. All you have is a story, a set of practices, and the fragile confidence that the brothers and sisters around you mean what they say and will stand by you when pressure comes. So a text like the Apocalypse of Peter takes a torch to any behaviour that cracks that trust. Gossip, perjury, doctrinal manipulation, spiritual showmanship, they're not just personal flaws, they're threats to survival. and it dramatizes the stakes in the only currency most people really feel, the body. If words can destroy, then in the vision, words are answered by destruction. At this point, you can almost feel the moral map widening under your feet. First, the tour shows you how misused speech tears at the fabric of community. Next, it's going to move into sins of the body and sins of the purse, how desire and wealth can be turned into tools of harm just as surely as the tongue can. Sexual practices, reproductive choices, feasting and drunkenness. Hoarded grain, unpaid wages, land seized from the poor. All of these will get their own zones, their own grotesque mirrorings. What holds the whole thing together is the same basic conviction. In God's world, nothing is harmlessly just personal. Your words, your body, your bank account, your rituals, every one of them either builds or corrodes the little communities trying to embody a different way of being human. We've walked through the kind of speech that corrodes. Next, we turn to the body, how the apocalypse of Peter imagines desire, sex, and physical life itself becoming either a site of holiness or a site of ruin. If speech is the first battleground, sex is the second. When the tour turns from tongues to bodies, the temperature drops and spikes at the same time. The tone gets colder, more judgmental, the imagery gets hotter, more explicit. You can feel the author walking a tightrope between fascination and horror. In the apocalypse of Peter, sexual behavior is not just one moral issue among many. It's a central arena where loyalty to God, loyalty to the community, and loyalty to your own desires collide. The basic pattern we saw with speech still holds. The punishment mirrors the act. But now the focus is on what people did with their genitals, wombs, and appetites. We get scenes of men who defiled themselves and others, hanging by their private parts. We see women who adorned themselves for adultery hanging by their hair over boiling muck, or being tormented in ways that emphasize breasts and wombs. There are passages that seem to target abortion and infanticide, with women who destroyed their children standing up to their necks in gore, tormented by the very offspring they rejected. On the surface, this can look like pure sadism, sexualized torture arranged to titillate and disgust at the same time. But if you zoom out and ask, what is this text afraid of? A clear pattern starts to emerge. Ancient Mediterranean societies ran on three big moral currencies: honor and shame, household stability, and public order. Sex, in their view, touched all three at once. Honor was not individual self-esteem. It was public reputation, how others ranked you. For men, honor was bound up with controlling your household. Wives, children, slaves. For women, honor was bound up with sexual exclusivity, being attached to one man, bearing legitimate heirs, not drawing public male attention. An affair in that world wasn't just two consenting adults. It could scramble paternity lines, destabilize inheritance, shame families, and trigger feuds. A pregnancy that someone tried to hide or terminate could threaten the continuity of the household. A woman who dressed or acted provocatively in their eyes could be accused of inviting chaos into the tight little web of kin and patronage that held everything together. So when the apocalypse of Peter fixates on adulterers, seducers, and women who presented themselves to entice men, it's not inventing its anxieties from scratch. It's tapping into a long-standing cultural fear that sexual disorder is social disorder. The punishments make that logic brutally visible. Men who treated bodies as playgrounds have their own bodies exposed and mutilated. Women who used beauty, in the author's view, to destabilize households are suspended by the very hair and ornaments they used. Those who tried to erase inconvenient pregnancies cannot escape the reality of those bodies in judgment. It's not just about purity in some abstract spiritual sense. It's about who controls which bodies and whose interests are served when desire starts making decisions. But the framing here is not neutral. The text is written in a world where male perspective is default, and it shows adulterous women are often described in terms of adornment, seduction, and cosmetics. Their interior lives barely register. Men, by contrast, are more commonly targeted for their actions, seducing, raping, exploiting, abandoning. Even when a specific line of punishment lands on a male body, the narrative lens tends to explain his sin in terms of what he did, not how he looked. That asymmetry tells you a lot about the community's assumptions. Women's bodies are imagined as sources of temptation, potential weak points through which chaos seeps in. Men's bodies are imagined as instruments, tools that can be wielded rightly or wrongly. So this hell tour is not a gender-balanced exploration of erotic ethics. It's a male-coded moral map that reflects its time. Suspicious of female agency, worried about male self-control, and terrified about what happens when either slips out of the expected roles. And that brings us to an important distinction for modern viewers. Describing how the Apocalypse of Peter talks about sex is not the same thing as endorsing it. You can read these passages as windows into ancient moral imagination without signing up for their values. You can say, this is what some early Christians feared. This is how they tied women's bodies to community danger. This is how they imagined divine justice working without making those images your own. If you miss that distinction, two things tend to happen. On one side, people baptize the whole package. They assume that because this text is early, or because it was once popular among Christians, its sexual ethic must somehow be closer to the original. They carry its anxieties forward uncritically, even when they no longer share the social conditions that produced them. On the other side, people dismiss it as nothing but misogynistic torture porn. They decide that because the imagery is harsh and gendered, it has nothing to teach us except what to reject. Both moves flatten something that's more complicated. Yes, there is misogyny here. The allocation of blame between men and women is not even. The fixation on female adornment and reproductive choices reveals a community trying to police women's bodies more strictly than men's. But there is also a genuine concern about exploitation, betrayal, and power. In some strands of the text, men who assault or trade on sexual access are singled out fiercely. Those who rape, those who demand sex as part of their leadership role, those who coerce, these figures are not romanticized. They are thrown into the harsher corners of the tour. In that sense, the Apocalypse of Peter participates in a broader biblical theme. God as defender of the vulnerable against those who use sex to dominate. The way the text tries to drive that lesson home is through the body. Bodily imagery here isn't just decorative, it's rhetorical technology. When you tell someone adultery is bad, you can get a nod, and then nothing changes. When you narrate an adulterer hanging by the organ he used, crying out in shame before a crowd of righteous onlookers, you're not aiming at intellectual assent. You're aiming at the gut. You want disgust. You want fear. You want the person hearing it to imagine themselves in that position, feel their stomach turn, and then carry that reaction with them whenever temptation comes up. Modern psychology would call this affective conditioning. The Apocalypse of Peter is in that sense a manual for self-policing, associates certain behaviours with such overwhelming horror that you stop yourself long before you get near them. This strategy isn't unique to this text. Other early Christian and Jewish writings do similar work. The Book of Revelation, for instance, portrays the great imperial city as a gaudy prostitute, Babylon the Great, mother of whores, whose lovers will end up ruined. The sexual language is metaphorical, but it plays on the same honour, shame codes, the same association of illicit desire with catastrophic downfall. The wisdom of Sirach warns against lingering at the door of another man's house, against being captivated by a woman's beauty in the street. 1 Thessalonians urges believers to control your own body in holiness and honour. not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles. The Didache, an early Christian teaching manual, flatly prohibits abortion and infanticide, listing them alongside magic, murder, and idolatry. Across these texts you see the same logic. To belong to God is to treat bodies, yours and others, as belonging to Him, not to impulse. Sex is not private recreation, it's covenantal, communal, and monitored. The Apocalypse of Peter turns that shared ethic into a full-colour surround sound horror exhibit. Not everyone has agreed on whether that's a good thing. Some interpreters see this as a necessary moral teaching tool for a volatile age. You're forming little countercultural communities inside a sexually permissive empire. Rome's elites flaunt mistresses, visit brothels, expose unwanted infants. The empire itself treats conquered bodies as disposable. In that environment, a restrained sexual ethic could look not like repression, but like resistance, especially for the vulnerable. On that reading, the Hell Tour is shock therapy. Exaggerated, yes. Grotesque, yes. But aimed at protecting women, children, and the poor from the predations of the powerful by scaring potential predators straight. Others are not so charitable. From this angle, the Apocalypse of Peter isn't just stern. It's trauma literature. It takes normal human desires, longing, curiosity, the wish to be attractive, and attaches them to images of endless torture. It teaches people to fear their own bodies. It reinforces patriarchal control by making women internalize horror at the idea of stepping outside prescribed roles. It's very possible that in real communities it did both. For some, hearing these visions may have firmed up a sense of moral seriousness. Sex is not trivial. My actions ripple out into others' lives. God cares about what I do with my body. For others, especially those already carrying shame or abuse, these same images may have deepened fear and self-loathing. The text itself doesn't resolve that tension. It just keeps turning the crank. Desire, consequence, body, pain. But even here the tour is not finished. If misuse of the body can corrupt a household, misuse of money can corrupt a whole city. After exposing sexual and reproductive sins as threats to the micro-unit of the family, the Apocalypse of Peter widens its lens again. Next come the people who hoard while others starve, who get fat on unpaid wages, who turn land and labour into their private hell-avoiding insurance plan, only to find themselves centre stage in the next circle of judgment. If sex is where households live or die, money is where entire worlds tilt. When the tour moves from bedrooms to bank accounts, the atmosphere changes again. The imagery is still grotesque, but the stakes feel bigger. We're not just talking about who slept with whom. We're talking about who ate, who starved, who froze outside while someone else's pantry overflowed. The Apocalypse of Peter is relentless on this point. Economics is moral, and moral failures with money get remembered. In one strand of the tradition you get the rich who refuse to share, dangling over a pit of filth, their wealth useless, their bodies exposed. In another, those who took interest upon interest, or who squeezed the poor for repayment, are tormented by the very coins they worshipped, molten metal flowing over them like lava. The pattern from earlier sections holds. The punishment fits the crime. But now the crime is not a private vice. It's neglect, exploitation, and calculated indifference. These aren't people who just liked nice things. They are people who, in the text's imagination, stepped over the hungry on their way to the market, who knew widows and orphans by name and still locked their granaries, who turned debt into a slow-motion strangling device and called it good business. And the author wants you to feel that as violence. In the world that produced this text, Roman law didn't usually describe refusing charity as a crime. Charging high interest might be frowned on in some circles, but it wasn't the kind of thing that landed you in court. Neglect of the poor could be woven into the fabric of how things are. The Apocalypse of Peter rips that fabric wide open. Behind the respectable facades, nice villas, honoured seats at banquets, it sees an invisible casualty list. Children whose growth was stunted, labourers worn down decades early, women forced into desperate choices because the cushion of generosity was never there. So when the Hell Tour displays misers being gnawed, flayed or submerged in filth, it isn't inventing a new form of cruelty. It's revealing one. What looked normal gets reclassified as bloodshed. You can hear faint echoes here of older biblical voices. The prophets of Israel had already accused wealthy landowners of grinding the faces of the poor, of joining house to house and field to field until there was no space left for anyone else. They spoke of unpaid wages crying out to God, of marketplaces rigged with false scales. The Apocalypse of Peter takes that accusation and gives it flesh, or more precisely, gives it shredded flesh, burning skin, endless hunger. In that sense, the afterlife scene is not just a prediction, it's a critique of the present. You're meant to look around your own city, its landlords, its tax collectors, its patrons, and see their future overlaying their present. That pompous patron at the feast. Imagine him now as the centrepiece in a different sort of banquet, food for worms. That estate you pass on the road. Picture its owner dangling over a river of fire, crying out for the cup of water he never offered anyone else. The hierarchy flips. People who stood above others in life end up below in judgment, crushed under weights they once shifted onto others' shoulders. Those who made others wait at their gate now stand at a much more terrible gate, begging entrance. This is one of the most potent rhetorical moves in the whole text, inversion of status. The same move shows up in Jesus' traditions. Think of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke. A nameless rich man feasts every day while a starving beggar rots at his door. After death, their situations reverse. Lazarus is comforted, the rich man burns, begging for relief that never comes. Is the Apocalypse of Peter based on that parable? We can't prove direct borrowing, but the thematic overlap is hard to miss. Both imagine wealth without compassion as a kind of self-built furnace. Both imagine a permanent gap opening between those who suffered and those who made a lifestyle out of not noticing. And both are aimed at real people making real choices about their resources. For early Christians, generosity wasn't an optional extra. It was part of the brand. Writings from roughly the same period push this constantly. The Didache tells Christians to share all things with their brothers and sisters, not to turn away the needy. Acts of the Apostles describes an idealized community where no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, where people sold land and laid the proceeds at the apostles' feet for distribution. Even if the historical reality never matched that utopian picture, the ideal mattered. To belong to the Jesus movement was, among other things, to be known for almsgiving and communal care. The Apocalypse of Peter turns that ethos into raw fear. It's not content to say, you should give. It says, if you don't, the faces you refused will face you again in court, in judgment, in the dark. The coins you clutched will melt in your hands. The bread you didn't break becomes the hunger that now gnaws you forever. This is social identity formation by terror, but it's also continuity with something gentler. In the Gospels, Jesus tells a story about a final evaluation where people are sorted based on how they treated the least of these, the hungry, the stranger, the prisoner. Those who fed, clothed and visited discover they were serving Christ himself. Those who didn't discover they were neglecting him. The Apocalypse of Peter shares that logic, but it cranks the volume. If Christ is mysteriously present in the poor, then indifference to their suffering is not a neutral act. It's a kind of violence against him, against them, against the whole body that, in early Christian imagination, is supposed to be one. And violence in this text always comes back on your own body. That's why economic injustice is portrayed with such graphic bodily punishment, even when the initial sin looked like paperwork or pricing strategy. Overcharging on loans, refusing alms, skimming off wages, these things don't look bloody. But they produce blood. They produce malnutrition, disease, desperation. So the Torah makes that hidden harm visible, legible in flesh. You can see a similar move in some Jewish apocalyptic writings, like 1 Enoch, where corrupt rulers and rich oppressors are accused not just of greed, but of devouring the poor. The metaphor is already there. Exploitation as a kind of cannibalism. The apocalypse of Peter just runs with it. Those who devoured others are devoured in turn. This also tells you something about how early Christians thought of power. Power in this worldview is not neutral, it's risky. The more leverage you have over others' lives, through money, status, office, the more your judgment scene will focus on what you did with that leverage. There are hints in the text that church leaders who turned their role into a revenue stream, or who favoured the rich over the poor in assemblies, are not exempt. The same flames that lick at pagan oppressors are ready for baptized exploiters too. Almsgiving, by contrast, becomes a kind of anti-violence. To give is not just to be nice, it's to interrupt a chain of harm. To refuse to let hunger, debt, or exposure run their course unchecked. Every coin given, every meal shared, is imagined as a small act of resistance against a world configured for the comfort of the few. No wonder generosity became such a marker of Christian identity. It wasn't just about virtue signalling, it was about reconfiguring who counted, who survived, who mattered. And again, the text is not subtle in how it motivates this. You don't just gain a good reputation, you avoid the fate of those who saw the poor and passed them by. You avoid standing one day in a crowd of familiar faces, all of whom can say, "You had and you didn't share." There's a darker side to this rhetoric, of course. Linking charity to fear of hell can create communities where giving is driven less by compassion and more by anxiety, where the poor become spiritual insurance policies rather than neighbours, where the failure to meet every need feels like a sliding step toward punishment. But within the harshness, you can still see a moral intuition trying to surface. Systems that normalize neglect are themselves violent, and God, if God is just, cannot shrug at that. The apocalypse of Peter uses the only tools it seems to trust to make that point stick: shocking images, inverted hierarchies, embodied consequences. And it hints that economic injustice is not just a human failing, it's part of a larger war. Because behind the landlords and moneylenders, behind the officials who look the other way, there are, in this cosmology, other forces at work. Powers and principalities that thrive on idolatry, on loyalty to the wrong gods, on worshipping the emperor or the market instead of the creator. To really understand why the Torah spends so much time on persecutors, idol makers, and those who bow to imperial images, we have to widen the lens one more time, from households and city streets to the whole cosmos. That's where the next stop on this journey takes us, away from greedy hands and hoarded grain, and into the realm of rival altars, broken loyalties, and a universe that, in the apocalypse of Peter's imagination, is split by war. In the apocalypse of Peter, greed and violence aren't just personal failures. They're symptoms of a much larger problem, giving your loyalty to the wrong powers. Once the text has dragged you through scenes of economic cruelty, it starts lifting your gaze upward. The question shifts from, "What did you do with your money?" to "Whose side are you on?" And it answers that in the sharpest, most polarized way it knows how. There are only two camps. There is the God revealed in Christ, and there is everything else. That everything else gets grouped under a big, loaded word, idolatry. To modern ears, idolatry can sound like a dusty theological term. Carved statues, incense, some prayers. What's the big deal? In the world of the apocalypse of Peter, It was much more than a question of correct religion. It was about which community you belonged to, which network of loyalties you participated in, which empire you helped uphold every time you walked into a temple or joined a procession. The vision takes those social facts and turns them into cosmic fault lines. In several strands of the text, people who serve strange gods or made images and bowed to them are shown in torment. Sometimes they're hung over flames, sometimes attacked by the very demons they courted. Sometimes they're associated with the ones who led others into false worship, craftspeople who made idols, priests who presided at their rites, magistrates who enforced participation. To a Roman, this might seem overblown. Sacrificing to the gods, honouring the emperor's genius, burning a pinch of incense, these were framed as the glue that held society together. Civic rites, public festivals, loyalty oaths. They were how you proved you were a good member of the city, a safe neighbour, a trustworthy colleague. The Apocalypse of Peter flips that script. What Rome calls piety, the text calls betrayal. What looks like respect for tradition shows up as complicity with demons. Those elegant altars in marble and bronze are reimagined as feeding stations for hostile spirits. Idolatry, in this book's imagination, is not a harmless mistake. It's an allegiance test, and that's where the social and political stakes come crashing in. For early Christian communities, refusing idolatry wasn't mainly about passing a theology quiz. It was about refusing the basic civic rituals that made you legible as a loyal subject of the empire. Imagine living in a small town in the provinces. The city has a patron deity. The emperor's birthday is celebrated with sacrifices. Local business guilds meet in a temple dining room, where the meat on the table has just been offered to a god. Your neighbours show up, your clients show up, your boss shows up. The expectation is not sinister, it's just life. You attend, you pour a libation, you mumble a formula, maybe you don't even believe it that deeply, but you participate. Now imagine you're a Christian shaped by texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. In your mental world, those little acts are not neutral. They're acts of worship. They're marks of which side you are on in an invisible war. The vision plays that inner conflict out on a massive screen. Those who compromise, those who bow, burn incense, eat at the wrong tables, take part in sacrifices as if they mean nothing, don't just go along to get along. They join the losing side. They join in the text's heavy symbolism, the persecutors, and persecution is never far from view. The Apocalypse of Peter comes from a world where Christians could be mocked, excluded, fined, imprisoned, sometimes killed for exactly these kinds of refusals. Not constantly, not everywhere, but enough that stories of witnesses, martyrs, seep into the communal memory. So when the hell scenes turn to those who killed the righteous or those who delivered them up, it's not vague moralizing. It's about magistrates who signed warrants, informers who pointed fingers, neighbours who dragged Christians into court, judges who ordered torture until someone finally agreed to swear by the emperor's genius. In the text's afterlife, those figures are unmasked. The same officials who held all the power in the courtroom end up powerless, bound, tormented by the very agents they once thought they controlled. The ones who forced others to denounce Christ now are forced into acknowledgements of guilt they can never escape. The ones who used the apparatus of the state to break bodies now find their own flesh subjected to endless breakage. This is promised vindication, not just punishment. For a community that had watched its own people suffer, sometimes with no earthly justice whatsoever, the vision says the story isn't done. The balance sheet isn't final. The ones who orchestrated your humiliation, the ones who weaponized civic rituals and imperial cults against you, will one day stand where you stand now, stripped of status, with no patron to intervene. You can feel how that would land in a small, vulnerable group. Every time a Christian was asked to offer incense or face penalties, it wasn't just an individual conscience crisis. It was a community flashpoint. Do you encourage the hesitant member to just go along? Do you tell them God will understand? Or do you hold the line and risk losing them to fear, or losing them to death? The apocalypse of Peter weighs in by turning everyday decisions into loyalty tests with eternal stakes. Participating in civic rites becomes the classic pressure point. A feast in a temple dining room, a festival procession, a public oath that invokes the emperor or the gods, these situations blur the line between social event and religious act. The text clarifies that blur by making one side glow and the other side burn. It's not subtle. Worship belongs only to God. Any shading into just a bit of incense, just a token, just to keep the peace, gets folded into the category of idolatry. And idolatry, in apocalyptic imagination, is not simply wrong belief. It's treason. This is moral psychology by intensification. On one side, fear of compromise gets dialed all the way up. You're not just worried about losing status in the church or disappointing friends. You're haunted by images, those who bowed in the wrong place dangling over pits, tormented by the very powers they courted. Those who denied under pressure being denied when it matters most. On the other side, hope of reward is dialed up too. The same scenes that show persecutors in agony also show the persecuted shining. Those who endured are pictured as calm, honoured, comforted, sometimes as intercessors, sometimes as almost angelic. Their scars become badges, their losses become titles. Fear and hope lock together into a motivational engine. You hold the line not only because you dread the alternative, but because you are convinced that unseen eyes are watching, that your refusal matters in a universe-spanning conflict. Your private choice in a dim courtroom gets narrated as part of a cosmic testimony. That logic isn't unique to the apocalypse of Peter. You can see similar patterns in the book of Revelation. Revelation also takes ordinary civic realities, trade guilds, imperial images, public festivals, and recasts them as stages on which a spiritual war is playing out. Rome becomes Babylon. The emperor cult becomes beast worship. Economic participation in imperial systems is symbolized as receiving a mark on hand or forehead. The message there is parallel. Compromise with imperial idolatry is not just bad taste. It is alliance with the beast, with the dragon, with anti-God forces that are doomed to destruction. Endure, refuse, even if it costs you your life, and you will reign with the Lamb. The apocalypse of Peter doesn't use all the same symbols, but the underlying grammar is similar. Empire is never named as clearly, but its machinery is visible in the persecutors, officials, soldiers, judges. Idolatry is not always mapped onto a specific cult, but the idea that there are rival powers behind statues, behind sacrifices, behind social pressure, that is everywhere. The cosmos is not neutral space, it is a battlefield. Other Jewish and Christian apocalypses of the period share this sense too. 4 Ezra, 2 Baruch, parts of 1 Enoch. They all confront empire, suffering, and loyalty. They all imagine heavenly books, angelic watchers, judgments that will finally expose what was hidden. They all tell small, struggling communities that their choices are seen and their tears are stored. What's distinctive about the apocalypse of Peter is how tightly it knits that cosmic drama to the visceral imagery of punishment and reward we've been walking through. The same framework that judges the greedy landlord also judges the emperor cult priest. The same flames that lick at the unmerciful rich also await the magistrate who ordered tortures. The same promise that the poor will be comforted also guarantees that those who broke under pressure yet returned in repentance are not invisible. It paints a world where every dinner invitation, every guild meeting, every civic festival can feel loaded. Not because Christians are meant to be paranoid, but because in this text's imagination, history is nearing its breaking point. The normal ways of keeping the peace, playing along, offering lip service, separating inner belief from outer practice, are no longer safe. What looks like a small compromise can be a step across a line that, in apocalyptic time, is being drawn with particular clarity. That's exhilarating and terrifying at once. Exhilarating because your loyalty suddenly matters more than you ever guessed. Terrifying because the margin for error feels thin and the consequences are drawn in fire. This sharpness is part of why the Apocalypse of Peter was so compelling, and also part of why it became theologically tricky. Because once you divide the world into stark camps, idolaters and worshippers of the true God, persecutors and persecuted, compromisers and confessors, you have to answer a dangerous question: is that line final? Is there any mercy beyond it? Any possibility of change after judgment has fallen? Any room for the condemned to be rescued or the torments to end? Some versions of the Apocalypse of Peter dare to toy with that possibility, at least for some. And those daring notes are exactly what later copyists, bishops, and readers would argue over. To see just how controversial this little book could become, we have to follow it into its most unsettling territory. Passages where hell might not be as permanent as you thought, where the cries of the damned still reach someone's ears, and where even apocalyptic fire flickers with hints of mercy. In some strands of the Apocalypse of Peter, the answer to that dangerous question is not a clean, resounding no. That's the shock. You've just walked through scene after scene where punishments track sins with eerie precision. You've felt the pressure of loyalty tests, the terror of getting it wrong in a world where compromise equals treason. You're primed to expect one more hard line. Judgment is final. Case closed. And then in some versions of the text, a different sound breaks in. It's the sound of pleading in these traditions. After Peter has seen all those torments, something happens that doesn't fit the neat schema. The righteous, those shining figures who endured persecution, who refused the idols, who passed the tests, look at the condemned, and they don't just nod approvingly at divine justice. They feel pity. They begin to intercede. They ask Christ to have mercy even on those in punishment, to let them out, to bring them into rest. In some readings, Christ responds with a promise that because of the prayers of the righteous, God will grant them relief. The flames won't burn forever. The tortures will end. Not for everyone, not indiscriminately. The details vary. But the very idea that the damned might someday be released after judgment is like a theological grenade rolled into the middle of the Afterlife tour. Now, you might hear that and think, isn't that just later softness sneaking in? Or on the other side, isn't that clearly what the earliest Christians believed before things got harsher? Both of those are live theories in modern scholarship. To see why, you have to zoom out. From the 2nd and 3rd centuries onward, early Christians were arguing about the scope of salvation. Some teachers leaned into images of a narrow road and a small flock. For them, apocalyptic judgment scenes were warnings. Not everyone escapes. Not all roads lead to life, and the line drawn at death is basically fixed. The Apocalypse of Peter, in its harsher strands, fits very easily into that world. But there were other threads. Some thinkers, especially in the Greek-speaking East, toyed with what we would now call universalist or restorationist ideas. The basic intuition was this: if God is truly good, truly powerful, and truly patient, then maybe the end of the story is not an eternal stalemate between a happy few and an ocean of misery. Maybe the goal of divine punishment is ultimately remedial. Maybe after long ages of purification, all rational creatures are brought back into harmony with God. You see flashes of this in Origen of Alexandria, who speculates about a final restoration of all things. You see ripples in Gregory of Nyssa, several generations later. You see it in some strands of later Christian mysticism. It was never the only view, and it was often contested, but it was there in conversation. Now put the Apocalypse of Peter into that mix. You have a text that is about as graphic and uncompromising as you can get about punishment. And then, at least in some copies, you have this late-breaking note, the righteous pleading for the damned, Christ granting an eventual release, hell functioning less like a sealed vault and more like a furnace that eventually goes out. That's why the mercy passages matter so much. They show that for at least some readers and copyists, the idea of post-judgment mercy wasn't unthinkable. It could be written right into the most fearsome apocalyptic tour they knew. But here's where it gets messy. We don't have just one apocalypse of Peter. We have different textual witnesses, most notably a Greek version and an Ethiopic version, that don't always line up. In broad strokes, they tell the same story. Same Peter, same heavenly guide, same sweeping vision of sinners and punishments and rewards. But when you start paying attention to the details, especially around this question of mercy after judgment, you find crucial differences. In some Greek traditions, the let them out moment is clearer. The dialogue about the righteous pleading and Christ responding with a promise of eventual release is relatively straightforward. In the Ethiopic tradition, that material is more muted, rephrased, or missing. In a few witnesses, the sharpest edges of mercy have been sanded down. The door cracked open in one version looks closer to shut in another. There are debates over exact wording, over how to translate key phrases, over whether certain lines are scribal glosses or original components. But the overall pattern is that our surviving manuscripts don't all treat post-judgment mercy the same way. Some amplify it, some whisper it, some almost erase it. That raises a crucial question. What happened? One possibility is interpolation. Maybe the original Apocalypse of Peter was as hardline as any later medieval hell vision, and some sympathetic readers, already leaning toward restorationist ideas, added a comforting coda. The text as first written ended with unending punishments. The mercy scene was a theological aftermarket part bolted on to tame the terror. Another possibility flips that around. Maybe the earlier version included a strong mercy scene. Maybe the original imagination of the book was more complicated. Vivid punishments, yes, but also an eventual crossover, where the righteous, secure in their bliss, successfully intercede for the condemned. And maybe later copyists, living in a theological climate that had mostly settled on eternal fixed punishment, got nervous. They trimmed, reworded, or dropped the lines that made hell look temporary. There's also a regional angle. The Ethiopic Church had its own theological history, its own debates, its own patterns of liturgical use. The Greek-speaking churches of the Mediterranean had theirs. It's entirely possible that different communities, encountering this uncomfortable note in the Apocalypse of Peter, handled it differently. Some preserved the mercy passages as they received them. Others adjusted them to fit prevailing teaching. Others might have transmitted a mixed tradition from the start. The frustrating thing, from a historian's point of view, is that we don't have a time machine. We have manuscripts from centuries later, copying chains we can only partly reconstruct, and glimpses of what church leaders thought about the text from their own writings. Those leaders, when they mention the Apocalypse of Peter at all, often seem ambivalent. On the one hand, the book was clearly popular. Church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries know it. Some respected teachers think it's worth reading in church, even if they're not ready to put it on the same level as the Gospels or Paul's letters. On the other hand, when canon lists start to harden and bishops start debating which books can be read as scripture, the Apocalypse of Peter keeps sliding into the maybe not column. You can imagine why. If you're trying to stabilize doctrine, especially around something as pastorally loaded as the afterlife, ambiguity is not your friend. A text that gives you lurid, highly motivating punishment scenes is one thing. A text that then hints those punishments might not be final, that intercession might break open the prison, complicates your preaching. Some church leaders likely worried about the moral effect. If the faithful began to think hell was temporary, would that blunt the warning function of judgment? Would people take sin less seriously? Would martyrs' blood seem less precious if, eventually, persecutors and persecuted end up in the same redeemed company? Others would have theological concerns. If one line of teaching emphasizes eternal punishment as a fixed category, then a popular book whispering, maybe not quite eternal, cuts across that. It feeds universalist currents. It aligns, at least in tone, with Origin-like speculation that was already under suspicion in some quarters. For bishops wary of doctrinal drift, it might be safer to sideline the book than to keep defending its complexity. That doesn't mean there was a secret meeting where someone said, "This book is too merciful, ban it." History is almost never that simple. It's more like a long, uneven process where certain texts feel increasingly awkward to read aloud when you're trying to teach a clear, uniform picture of the afterlife. Over time, the awkward ones get quoted less, copied less, and eventually fall to the margins. So what can we responsibly say about the mercy passages? We can say that some ancient Christians reading the Apocalypse of Peter knew a version where the saved prayed for the damned and were heard. We can say that, at least in some manuscript traditions, that idea is not a tiny aside but a climactic twist, pity breaking into punishment, intercession stretching beyond death. We can also say we don't know exactly when that twist entered the text or how uniform it ever was. The evidence we have is late, fragmentary, and filtered through communities with their own theological instincts. Any confident claim, the original text definitely taught universal salvation, or the original text definitely had only eternal hell, goes beyond what the manuscripts can support. What we're looking at instead is a window into live debates. The Apocalypse of Peter shows us that early Christian reflection on judgment was not monolithic. Even inside a single work, copied and recopied for centuries, you can see friction between terror and hope, justice and mercy, finality and restoration. The textual variants are not just technical details for specialists. They're fossils of real arguments, real anxieties, real longings for a God who is both just enough to confront evil and good enough to heal what has been broken. And that's part of why this book, for all its contested status, left such a deep imprint. Even without making it into the New Testament, it helped set the emotional palette for Christian imagination. The detailed hellscapes, the intense focus on moral consequence, the possibility, however fragile, that even the worst story might not end where you think. In the next section, we'll trace that influence forward. We'll watch how images and ideas from the Apocalypse of Peter seep into later visions of heaven and hell, how medieval artists, poets, and preachers borrowed and reshaped its scenes, and how a book that never made the canonical cut still helped teach generations of Christians what the afterlife looked like when they closed their eyes. When you follow those images forward through history, you start to notice something. The Apocalypse of Peter never got the official stamp of Scripture, but it didn't have to. It lived in people's heads. That's one of the strange powers of non-canonical texts. They can fall off the formal reading lists and still keep shaping how people imagine the world. Because for most ordinary Christians across the centuries, doctrine didn't arrive as neat theological propositions. It arrived in stories told aloud, in sermons, in songs, in painted walls, in whispered warnings to children. And the Apocalypse of Peter is almost perfectly designed for that ecosystem. Short enough to retell from memory. Vivid enough that once you've heard it, you can't unsee it. Structured enough that preachers can raid it for examples. Let me tell you about the man who mocked the poor, and what he saw after he died, even when bishops and canon lists were becoming wary of treating the book as scripture. Its scenes kept leaking into Christian imagination through other channels. Early homilies pick up its basic move without always naming it. This sin, this fate, that cruelty, that torment, this virtue, this glowing reward. You can hear the same rhythm in later penitential preaching, where priests walk their congregations through the catalogue. The adulterer, the blasphemer, the false witness, each with their own tailored payback. We don't always have a neat footnote saying, as the Apocalypse of Peter teaches, but the pattern is there, a kind of moral geometry. The body misused in sin is the body used in punishment. The tongue that lied now burns. The eyes that lusted now stare at what they cannot have. That's the logic this text helped crystallize. Once that logic exists, it's easy to carry it around, to remix it, to expand it. You start seeing what scholars sometimes call apocalyptic tours popping up all over the late antique and medieval landscape. Guided journeys where a visionary, sometimes a saint, sometimes a curious everyman, gets taken by an angel through the afterlife, room by room. They stop, look, ask questions. Why is this person suffering like that? What did they do? And the guide explains. Some of these later tours almost certainly knew the Apocalypse of Peter directly or through summaries. Others just swim in the same pool of ideas. The Vision of Paul, a wildly popular text in the early Middle Ages, reads at times like a deluxe expansion pack for Peter's tour. More sinners, more torments, more detail. The Vision of Tundale, centuries later, does something similar in an Irish context. Each new vision adds local sins, local anxieties, but plugs them into that familiar basic structure. You can think of the Apocalypse of Peter as one of the earliest prototypes of this genre in Christian tradition, the guided hell tour with moral commentary. Once that prototype exists, it's astonishingly adaptable. Over time, all of this gets systematized. What starts as a set of scary stories and vivid warnings slowly hardens into something like a moral map. Medieval penitential manuals, handbooks for confessors, start listing sins and their appropriate penances. Beside or behind those pastoral instructions, another layer grows, unofficial catalogues of what those sins will look like if left unconfessed in the world to come. Not every list quotes Peter, but the family resemblance is unmistakable. It's the same impulse you saw in the Apocalypse of Peter, to match sin and punishment one-to-one, to make the correspondence feel precise and in some sense fair. You did this with your hands. This will happen to your hands. You used your wealth to crush the poor, now that wealth crushes you. That sin-specific logic becomes so embedded in Christian moral imagination that it can start to feel like common sense. Of course liars should be silenced. Of course gluttons should starve. Of course the proud should be brought low. The Apocalypse of Peter didn't invent those intuitions, but it gave them some of their earliest, stickiest narrative form. And once something has a story, it's much easier to preach. Imagine a late antique bishop standing up to give a homily against greed. He could gesture in the direction of abstract eschatology. There will be a judgment, and God will repay each according to their works. Or he could draw from the apocalyptic tour tradition. I have read how those who rob widows will be hung up by their tongues, while the widow's tears burn them like fire. That second option lands differently. It's not just a principle, it's a scene. We see echoes of Peter's emotional mechanics in homilies that describe the saints rejoicing at justice, then weeping at mercy. In visionary accounts where the seer is allowed to ask for the release of a few souls, and is sometimes but not always granted it. In sermons that walk that knife edge between terror and pity, trying to scare you straight without making you despair. By the time you get to the high medieval period, the stage is set for one of the most famous afterlife tours in Western literature, Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, we have to be careful here. We don't have evidence that Dante sat down with a copy of the Apocalypse of Peter in front of him. The lines of direct dependence are blurry, tangled, and often hypothetical. What we can say is that he's working in a world already saturated with the patterns that texts like Peter helped establish. Look at the structure of Dante's Inferno. You descend, circle by circle, Each level clusters a particular kind of sin. The punishments are not random. They're fitting, often ironically so. The lustful are blown by wind, the wrathful stew in their own rage. The false counsellors burn in flickering flames that mirror their deceptive words. It's the same basic innovation you saw centuries earlier, moral life translated into spatial architecture. Ethics turned into a landscape you can walk through, with neighbourhoods for every vice. The Apocalypse of Peter is cruder, simpler, almost like a sketch by comparison. But the emotional mechanics line up. Both works rely on the shock of recognition, when the punishment reveals the truth of the sin. Both are structured around a guided tour with a heavenly interpreter. Both invite the reader to feel more than one thing at once: revulsion at evil, fear of judgment, and in certain moments a stab of compassion. And it's not just Dante. Eastern Christian visionary literature, Syriac homilies, Byzantine hymns, Ethiopian and Coptic texts, all of these traditions develop their own hell tours, their own specialized punishments, their own language for what happens when you misuse your body, your money, your power. Some of them show clear verbal parallels to the Apocalypse of Peter. Others just belong to the same ecosystem. Either way, you can feel the gravitational pull of that early vision pulling later imaginations into orbit. So why does this genre keep coming back? Why do Christians, again and again, draw detailed maps of a place they claim never to have visited? One answer is psychological. Abstract moral principles are hard to feel. God is just can sit lightly on your mind. But a scene, someone like you, with your habits and shortcuts, standing in a place where those habits have been made visible and inescapable, hits differently. It takes the distant, hazy future and drags it into the present. That's part of what made the Apocalypse of Peter so effective. It took a world of persecution, compromise, and fraught choices and said, these decisions don't just affect your reputation or your comfort. They reach into the structure of reality. The pressure your persecutors put on your body will be balanced. The pressure you put on others will be answered. Nothing gets lost. And that's another piece of the puzzle: justice. A lot of the people who love this text lived at the sharp end of injustice. They saw the powerful exploit the weak and then die peacefully in their beds. They watched faithful friends arrested, tortured, executed. They didn't have confidence that earthly courts would put things right. A vision like the Apocalypse of Peter offers something those courts never could: a cosmic audit. Every hidden act, every quiet cruelty, every unseen act of generosity is noticed. The book doesn't just promise a vague, better place. It spells out, in often excruciating detail, how the scales will be balanced. For many readers, that isn't just horror, it's comfort. Terrifying comfort, maybe, but still a sense that the universe is not finally indifferent. That double edge, fear and comfort, horror and hope, is one reason modern readers are still drawn to texts like this. On one level, they scratch the same itch as horror stories. There's a morbid fascination in walking through a catalogue of torments, seeing how creative human imagination can be when it's trying to picture the worst possible outcomes. You read these scenes with the same mix of dread and curiosity you might bring to a horror film, repelled but unable to look away. On another level, they speak to a deep longing many people still have, even in secular terms: the desire for some kind of moral accounting beyond what our courts, our politics, our social media storms can provide. We know, intuitively, that countless harms go unpunished and countless quiet goods go unrewarded. A book like The Apocalypse of Peter gives narrative form to the hope that this imbalance is not the final word. You don't have to agree with its theology to recognize the hunger it addresses. You might reject its mechanics entirely, see its punishments as projections of human cruelty, its hell as more revealing about us than about God. But even that critique assumes something important: that the way we imagine ultimate justice matters, that it feeds back into how we treat each other now. And that brings us back to the question of legacy. What does the Apocalypse of Peter leave us with, if not a place in the Bible? It leaves us a historical window into a world where Christians were trying to make sense of persecution, wealth, sexuality, loyalty, and mercy under the pressure of cosmic stakes. It shows us how ethical teaching, communal trauma, and storytelling fused into powerful imagined geographies. It lets us watch, almost in real time, how a non-canonical book can seep into preaching, art, and popular devotion long after official lists have passed it by. It also confronts us with the ambivalence built into Christian reflection on judgment from the start, the pull toward precise, terrifying justice, and the counterpull toward mercy that refuses to let even the damned go without a fight. In the final section, we'll gather those threads. We'll step back from the tour and ask, what does the Apocalypse of Peter really reveal about early Christianity's hopes and fears? Why did a book edged out of the canon still become one of the main templates for imagining heaven and hell? And what might it show us not just about how the ancients thought the story ends, but about how we today still wrestle with justice, mercy, and the possibility of a world made right? When you zoom all the way out, one thing becomes clear. The Apocalypse of Peter is not just a curiosity from the cutting room floor of early Christianity. It's a pressure point. Push on it, and a whole world of anxieties, hopes, and arguments starts to surface. Think about what we've seen. This was a text that some early Christians loved enough to copy, quote, and publicly read. Church leaders debated it. Lists of books to read in church sometimes put it right next to Revelation. The surviving manuscripts we do have are late and fragile, but the echoes in earlier writers are loud. That's the first big takeaway. This was not some fringe, secret book. For at least a while it was mainstream devotional reading. At the same time, it's morally intense in a way that even makes some modern readers flinch. The sins are specific, the punishments graphic, the stakes absolute. It doesn't leave much room for I made a mistake, but I'm basically a good person. Your choices are written into your body, into your forever. That's a second takeaway. The Apocalypse of Peter shows us an early Christian world that took moral formation with deadly seriousness. Then there's the paradox we've returned to again and again. Influential, yet marginalized. Formative, yet excluded. Quoted and copied, then quietly sidelined. It's tempting to collapse that into a simple story. The book was banned. The bad bishops suppressed the scary truth. That kind of narrative is appealing because it gives us clear heroes and villains. But the historical picture is more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. Nobody passes a single empire-wide edict that says, from this day forward, no one shall read the Apocalypse of Peter. What we see instead are layers of doubt accumulating. Some leaders are uneasy with how speculative the tour is. Some distrust revelation claims that don't come from an apostle they can firmly locate in history. Some are wrestling with the book's hints that post-mortem mercy might be possible, and they're not sure how to square that with the theological frameworks hardening around them. Over time, those reservations add up. By the 4th century, when big canon lists are crystallizing, the Apocalypse of Peter is in a grey zone. Not obscene, not heretical in a blunt way, but not quite solid enough to make the final cut. It slides from read in some churches to interesting but not scripture, to mostly referenced by scholars and collectors. So instead of a single dramatic ban, we get a long, uneven process of dispute and exclusion. That process is understandable if you put yourself in their shoes. Church leaders were trying to stabilize teaching in a world full of visions, revelations, and rival prophets. Drawing hard lines was part of how they protected communities from being pulled in every direction. At the same time, exclusion from the canon doesn't erase cultural impact. The imagery in this text kept flowing through sermons and visions and art, long after its official status cooled. In that sense, the Apocalypse of Peter is a perfect case study in how non-canonical doesn't mean unimportant. It just means important in a different way. So what can we say with some confidence, and where do we have to hold things loosely? On the solid side, we have material evidence that the text circulated in Greek and Ethiopic traditions. We can track its existence in multiple manuscripts, even if the chain is patchy. We have early Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria who seem to know and use it. Their references suggest that by the late 2nd century, this book was already in the mix. We have hints that some communities treated it with quasi-scriptural respect, reading it in liturgical settings, pairing it with texts that did make it into the New Testament. We can also see across centuries the family resemblance between its punishments and later hell tours. Even without footnotes, the continuity is hard to miss. On the debated side, authorship remains uncertain. The text claims to present a vision given to Peter, but most scholars think that's a literary device, not a literal diary entry from the apostle. It's what ancient writers often did, attach big ideas to big names to give them weight. The precise date is contested. Most place it in the 2nd century, maybe between 100 and 150 CE, but that's a range, not a timestamp. It's based on comparisons with other texts, references in early writers, and the development level of its theology. The theology of final fate is also contested. Does the text ultimately endorse eternal, unbreakable torment for all the damned? Or does that late scene of possible release indicate an underlying hope that even hell might not be God's last word? Different manuscript traditions and different ways of reading the key passage pull interpreters in different directions. All of that uncertainty isn't a flaw. It's exactly what you expect from a text living at the edges of canon formation, preserved in fragmentary ways, and copied by communities with different theological sensibilities. So how do we read it? You can approach the Apocalypse of Peter through multiple lenses at once, and each one reveals something different about early Christianity. As a pastoral warning, it's a tool for shaping behaviour. You don't just tell converts, be good. You show them in unbearable detail where certain paths lead. The goal isn't cruelty, it's deterrence. The horror is functional. As rhetorical persuasion, it's a piece of spiritual propaganda using shock, pity, and awe to pull readers toward a particular way of life. The vividness is the point. You remember what you feel, and this book wants you to feel. As community boundary making, it helps draw lines between us and them, idolatry, persecution, exploitation. These aren't just personal sins, they're identity markers. To walk this way is to belong to the people of God. To walk that way is to line up with cosmic enemies. The afterlife scenes dramatize those boundaries in technicolor. And as a hope for justice text, it speaks straight to wounded communities. If you've watched the powerful devour the weak with apparent impunity, a tour like this tells you the story isn't over. There's another court, another reckoning, another kind of time. That's part of why the imagery hits so hard. It externalizes hidden harms. Think about the sins the text keeps circling back to: secret corruption, whispered slander, private sexual coercion, financial oppression that never makes it into legal records. These are the kinds of evils that in real life often stay buried. Victims are silenced, paper trails vanish. The perpetrators die with clean reputations. The Apocalypse of Peter drags those buried things into the open. It takes inner habits, greed, contempt, deceit, and turns them into outer landscapes. Your tongue, which shaped lies in the dark, now burns in the light. Your wealth, which crushed others invisibly, now crushes you tangibly. The harm is no longer deniable, it's the air you breathe. For some readers, this is terrifying. For others, it's a deep, almost painful relief. Finally, a world where what was hidden is revealed, where people who hurt others don't just get away with it. Of course, this cuts both ways. A text like this can motivate repentance and protect the vulnerable. It can also be weaponized, used to control, to shame, to keep people in line through fear. You can feel that tension humming under the surface. The same images that comfort a persecuted widow might traumatize a child raised on threats of hellfire for every mistake. That's why this book is still such a mirror for us. It forces us to ask, how do fear and hope shape moral communities? Where does terror help us wake up to real harm? And where does it become its own kind of harm? How do we talk about justice in a way that honors victims without turning God into a cosmic torturer? How do we hold on to mercy without trivializing what people suffer? Those weren't abstract questions for the communities that first copied the Apocalypse of Peter. They were trying to live out loyalty to a crucified Messiah in a world that could kill them for it. They were wrestling with wealth in a Roman economy built on exploitation. They were negotiating sex, power, and truth, telling in tight, fragile congregations where one person's sin could fracture the whole group. In that context, a vision of the afterlife wasn't just speculation about what happens when you die. It was a way of saying, the way we treat each other now matters, forever. That's also why the book's marginalization is telling. The eventual discomfort with its authority doesn't mean early Christians stopped caring about justice or judgment. It suggests that, as theology developed, some leaders became wary of letting any single highly imaginative vision dominate the conversation. The canon that emerged is comparatively restrained in its descriptions of hell. It leaves more room for mystery, for ambiguity, for trust without a detailed map. But the maps never went away. They just moved into other genres, other texts, other traditions. The Apocalypse of Peter is one of the earliest surviving attempts to draw such a map in Christian terms. Once that template existed, it proved almost impossible to forget. And that brings us to now. Even if you don't believe in heaven or hell, you probably carry some mental picture of ultimate justice or injustice. Maybe it's karmic. Maybe it's historical. The arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. Maybe it's purely human, courts, movements, call-outs. However you slice it, you're imagining some kind of accounting. Texts like the Apocalypse of Peter let us see how another culture imagined that accounting and how that imagination fed back into daily life. They show us the raw materials out of which Christian ideas of judgment and mercy were assembled. They also raise a tantalizing question. If one book this vivid could be so central for a time, then slip to the margins, what else is out there? What other early Christian writings were once read aloud, memorized, loved, and then quietly forgotten, or preserved only in fragments in a monastery library, or resurfacing 1,000 years later in a desert jar? If you're curious about those lost and almost lost voices and you want to keep exploring the texts that hovered just outside the Bible but shaped Christian imagination anyway, stick around. If you found this deep dive into the Apocalypse of Peter helpful or unsettling in a thought-provoking way, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. How does this kind of afterlife imagery land with you? More harmful, more helpful, or something in between? And, as always, let me know where you're listening from.